What if your kindness is being used against you? Not in the obvious way, not manipulation you can see coming, but something slower, something that hides behind good intentions. Someone leans on your empathy, not to inspire you, not to connect with you, but to use you, because empathy is soft. It moves you. It makes you hesitate. And some people, they don't want your understanding. They want your obedience. You feel guilt when others suffer. That's natural. But guilt is a lever, and all it takes is the right pressure, the right story, the right moment, and suddenly you're saying yes to something you don't fully believe in. You're helping someone who has no intention of helping you. You're sacrificing your time, your energy, your peace, not out of generosity, but out of fear. Fear of what it means to say no. Fear of being cruel. Fear of being selfish. So you give, you listen, you forgive, again and again, even when it hurts you, even when it costs you, even when the person on the other side has already shown you they don't care. And the worst part is, you think this means you're a good person. You think enduring this pain makes you noble. But what if it's not goodness? What if it's just control? Because here's the uncomfortable part. Empathy isn't just a virtue, it's a vulnerability. It makes you predictable. If someone knows you can't stand to see others in pain, they can make sure you see it. If someone knows you'll feel responsible, they can place that responsibility in your hands, subtly, quietly, without ever making a demand, just a look, a sigh, a reminder of everything you could fix, if only you were better, stronger, kinder. And when you falter, when you finally resist, the guilt arrives, heavy, immediate. It doesn't matter that you were drained, overwhelmed, broken. It doesn't matter that the person asking never offered you the same care in return. You still feel like the bad one. Because your empathy is wired to respond, not to question. But what if you did question it? What if you looked closer, not at the pain, but at the pattern? What if you noticed that their needs always arrive when you're already tired? That their pain always becomes your responsibility? That their forgiveness always requires your sacrifice? What if the suffering they show you isn't shared, but wielded? It's hard to admit because it feels cruel. It feels paranoid. You don't want to believe someone would weaponize something so human, so intimate. But some people learn early how to manipulate care. They don't need to lie. They don't need to demand. They just need to pull the right string and wait. You'll do the rest. You'll talk yourself into helping, into tolerating, into staying. And when you finally burn out, when you finally collapse, it won't be them who's blamed. It'll be you for being too sensitive, too soft, too weak. Your empathy, once admired, will become the reason you failed, and they'll walk away untouched, searching for someone else to lean on, someone else to shape. You start to realize that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. It's surrender, it's self-erasure. And the person who taught you that saying no is cruel, they knew what they were doing. They needed you to feel that way. Because as long as you believed that empathy meant self-sacrifice, they could keep taking, they could keep asking, they could keep hurting you, and calling it connection. And maybe the most disturbing thought isn't that someone else used your empathy against you. Maybe it's that you let them, because deep down, you wanted to be needed. You wanted to feel like you were good, even if it meant losing pieces of yourself in the process. And now, even knowing all this, even feeling the truth settle in your chest, part of you still hesitates, still wonders if pulling away is the right thing. still worries that by protecting yourself, you're becoming cold, selfish, cruel, because that's the final trap. The one that keeps you quiet, keeps you complicit. The belief that if your empathy has limits, it must not be real, and that's how they win. Not by overpowering you, but by convincing you that protecting yourself is wrong, that your pain doesn't matter, that your silence is the price of being good. And you've paid it for so long, you almost forgot you had a choice. What if you don't want them to succeed, not because they're cruel or harmful or undeserving, but because they remind you of you, not the polished version of you that you show to the world, the earlier version, the struggling one, the one that tried hard and failed anyway, the one who felt invisible, misunderstood, or just not good enough. You see someone else standing where you once stood, and part of you wants to root for them. But another part doesn't. Another part hopes they fall. You tell yourself you don't mean it, that it's just a passing thought. But it lingers, quiet, persistent. You watch them speak, move, hope, and inside, something recoils. You notice the similarities, their voice, their ambition, the way they try to hide how badly they want it. It's all too familiar, and it feels unfair. Because no one made space for you. No one reached back and helped you through. You had to learn the hard way. You had to fail and break and rebuild from the pieces. So why should they get through untouched? Why should they succeed where you didn't? It's not jealousy, exactly. It's something colder, something tighter. You don't want what they have. You want them to feel what you felt. You want them to understand that pain, that silence, that invisible edge where the world quietly decides not to care. You don't want them to win until they've earned it the way you had to. But then you ask yourself, what does it mean to earn it? Pain didn't make you better. It made you guarded, careful, smaller. And now here you are, looking at someone who still believes, who hasn't been worn down yet. And you can't decide whether you admire them or want to see that belief crushed. You start to recognize the trap, that you've confused pain with wisdom, that somewhere along the way you began to think suffering gave you insight, that you can see things they can't. But maybe you're not wiser, maybe you're just hurt. And now their hope feels threatening because it reminds you of how much you've lost. You think you're protecting them from disappointment. But maybe you're just protecting yourself from being reminded of it. If they succeed, what does that say about your struggle? Was it necessary? Was it real? Or was it just wasted? You begin to resent their shortcuts, their luck, their support, not because it's wrong, but because it reveals how much you lacked. You feel the quiet bitterness rise, not against them, but against a world that gave them what it never gave you. And so you want them to fall, not out of hate, but out of hunger, a hunger for justice that never came for you. And when they do fall, even just a little, you feel it, that flicker of relief, that quiet satisfaction. You tell yourself you don't feel good about it. But the moment passes easier. Their stumble smooths out something jagged inside you. It restores balance, at least for a moment. Then the guilt sets in, because you know they didn't deserve it. They were just doing what you once did. Trying, hoping, believing. You see it now with cruel clarity. You don't want them to fail. You just don't want to be reminded that you did. And still the feeling doesn't go away. You try to support them. You say the right words, but inside you hesitate. Every compliment feels forced. Every encouragement feels like betrayal. Not of them, of you. Because if they make it, if they thrive, if they become what you never could, then what do you become? What's left of your struggle, your story, your meaning? You start to understand that this isn't about them at all. It never was. It's about the version of yourself you buried. the version that still aches, the version that never got the apology, never got the break, never got the chance. And maybe the cruelest part of all is that you're doing to them what was once done to you, withholding belief, quietly rooting for failure. Because deep down you learned that the world doesn't make space for two versions of you. Only one can survive. And if they rise, maybe you disappear. But you won't admit that. Not out loud. You'll just keep watching, smiling, supporting, quietly hoping, sometimes, that they fall. Not because you hate them, but because you still haven't forgiven the world for what it did to you. When you're happy, really, deeply happy, have you ever noticed how little you question anything? It's not just distraction. It's not just joy clouding your judgment. It's something more fundamental. When you're happy, your brain stops asking hard questions. It stops doubting. It stops analyzing. It starts trusting everything it sees, everything it hears, everything it feels. You don't notice it, but something switches off. The critical voice goes silent. The part of your mind that checks for danger, that evaluates consequences, that challenges assumptions, it goes quiet. And in that silence, something else grows louder. Confidence, certainty, a feeling that everything is exactly as it should be. But that certainty is often a lie, because when you're happy, your brain starts filtering the world. It doesn't want dissonance. It doesn't want contradiction. It starts ignoring anything that might challenge the feeling. It trades accuracy for comfort, truth for coherence. You make faster decisions. You trust your instincts more. You remember things selectively, only what confirms what you already believe. You interpret ambiguous situations as positive. You stop preparing for the worst. You stop noticing the cracks. And here's the disturbing part. You become easier to manipulate, not because you're weak, but because you're open. When you're happy, you're more agreeable, more trusting, more willing to comply. Your guard drops. You want to believe people mean well. You want the world to be kind, and you don't see the trap until you're already inside it. Marketers know this. Politicians know this. Even your own memories know this. Because happiness creates a kind of blindness, a curated reality where doubt is unnecessary. You don't test your assumptions when everything feels good. You don't challenge the narrative when it confirms your joy. You become less curious, less skeptical, less precise, and it feels good. That's what makes it so dangerous. Now think about sadness, or anxiety, or fear. When you're unhappy, your brain does the opposite. It scrutinizes, it questions, it loops endlessly through possibilities. It notices every detail. It prepares for threats. It checks again and again, uncertain, hyper-aware. You hate how that feels, but it's the same mechanism that keeps you alert, that helps you detect lies, that protects you from false certainty. Your smartest decisions often come from your darkest moods, not because pain is virtuous, but because discomfort forces clarity. Happiness smooths over complexity. Pain pulls you into it. But society doesn't reward this. You're encouraged to seek happiness constantly, to avoid discomfort, to optimize every moment for pleasure, calm, peace. You're taught that positive thinking leads to success, that good vibes create good outcomes, that doubt is weakness, that cynicism is toxic. So you chase happiness, you edit your life to feel lighter, easier, safer. You ignore the parts that complicate your comfort. You unfollow people who make you think too hard. You avoid conversations that create tension. You curate a bubble and call it clarity. But what if that clarity is just ignorance with a smile? What if happiness isn't wisdom at all, but a kind of strategic stupidity? a shutdown of deeper processing in favor of momentary relief. Your brain doesn't just lie to you when you're happy. It disables the parts of itself that could even detect the lie. It locks the doors, draws the curtains, and says, "Don't look too closely." And the more you need that feeling, the more you depend on it, the more dangerous it becomes. You stop learning, you stop adjusting, you stop evolving, because evolution requires friction. Growth requires discomfort. Insight requires resistance. But none of that feels good. And if your goal is to always feel good, then your mind will quietly sabotage its own intelligence just to keep the illusion alive. That's the trade. So maybe the question isn't how to be happy. Maybe the real question is how much truth are you willing to sacrifice to stay that way? Because the moment you become too happy, too certain, too at peace, your brain lets go of the steering wheel. And you don't even notice you're drifting. You just smile and keep going and forget to ask if you're still awake. What if the more frightening explanation is also the more reasonable one? Not just possible, not just plausible, but actually easier to believe. That's the problem, isn't it? We assume the truth is the one that makes us feel better, the version that reassures us, the one where people mean well, where systems work as intended, where outcomes are mostly fair. But what if those are the stories we tell, because the real explanations are harder to accept? Sometimes a comforting lie requires more effort to maintain than a disturbing truth does to believe. It takes mental gymnastics to explain away corruption, failure, cruelty, especially when they happen again and again. And after a while, the rational story is the one where people lie, exploit, and harm, because that's what consistently happens. And that's where things start to shift. Because your brain isn't just searching for what's true, it's searching for what makes sense. And the darker story often makes more sense. It explains why powerful people act without empathy, why systems reward the worst behaviors, why cruelty isn't punished but normalized. It doesn't require a conspiracy, it just requires self-interest, indifference, and the slow erosion of empathy over time. So you begin to see it everywhere. You stop giving the benefit of the doubt. You assume the worst because the worst keeps proving itself right. And now, suspicion feels like clarity. Cynicism feels like realism. You trust less, question more. You see a smiling face and wonder what it's hiding. You hear promises and expect betrayal. Because the alternative, the idea that people fail this badly by accident, over and over, is actually harder to believe. And still, you tell yourself you're just being objective, just seeing things as they are. But objectivity is a moving target when fear and pattern recognition work together. You begin to mistake pattern for intent. You assume that because bad things keep happening, someone must be orchestrating them. It feels rational. It feels precise. It feels like control. But here's the deeper twist. That fear, the one that tells you there's something worse hiding under the surface, feeds into itself. The more you believe it, the more evidence you see. You collect anecdotes, headlines, statistics, until doubt becomes certainty, until the scariest explanation becomes the only one that makes sense. And you don't even notice how much comfort there is in that fear. Because if the worst is true, at least you're not naive. At least you're prepared. You might feel helpless, but you don't feel foolish. You've chosen the explanation that hurts more because it hurts less than being blindsided. And now your mind starts closing doors. You don't consider other motives. You don't imagine honest mistakes. You assume the worst and stop looking further. You believe you're thinking critically, but really, you've just chosen a different kind of certainty. That's what makes this bias so powerful. Not just that we lean toward dark explanations, but that we convince ourselves those explanations are the only rational ones. We stop questioning them. We stop noticing how much we've stopped questioning. And eventually, the scariest version of every story becomes the one we believe by default. Not because it's more likely, but because it hurts less than being wrong again, being surprised again, being fooled again. And because deep down you've learned something terrifying, that the scarier truth doesn't just feel more rational, it often is. Everyone claps, and somehow that makes it harder to think. You say something simple, unremarkable, maybe even wrong, but the room nods, smiles, applauds. You feel a warmth rise in your chest, an ease, a lightness. For a moment, you forget to ask why they agreed. You forget to ask if what you said was actually true, because agreement feels good. It feels safe, and safety dulls your mind. That's the beginning of it. Not a manipulation, not a conspiracy, just the quiet erosion of thought. One small reward, one social cue, one gesture of approval at a time. And the more it happens, the more you start shaping what you say to earn it. You adjust, not because you're weak, but because you're human. Because something inside you is built to mirror others, to seek connection, to avoid rejection. You think you're being honest, but you've already begun to censor yourself. You might not notice at first. The changes are subtle. You start using the words that get nods. You start avoiding questions that make people uncomfortable. You speak less about what confuses you, more about what reassures them. And slowly, the applause becomes the goal. Not clarity, not truth. It becomes harder to say something you're unsure about. Harder to explore the things that don't have easy answers. You begin to fear the silence that follows uncertainty. You begin to fear the moment when no one claps. So you give them what they want. And every time they reward you, you reward yourself. You feel smart, accepted, validated. You feel right. But being applauded doesn't mean you're right. It just means you've said something familiar, something comfortable, something that doesn't challenge anyone too deeply. And eventually, you start to mistake comfort for truth. That's when you stop thinking, because thinking means risking. Thinking means discomfort. It means sitting with tension, doubt, contradiction. It means knowing that sometimes the right answer feels wrong. That clarity often begins with confusion. That truth rarely arrives with applause. But the more people agree with you, the harder it is to let go of what they believe. Even when something doesn't sit right, you hesitate. You tell yourself it's not the time, not the place, not worth the trouble. You rationalize your silence as tact, as maturity, as patience. But inside, something else is happening. You're learning to betray your own thoughts before anyone else has to. And over time, the part of you that once asked difficult questions begins to atrophy. That's what makes applause dangerous. Not because it's false, but because it's soothing. It creates the illusion that you're thinking when all you're doing is repeating. It creates the illusion that you're growing when all you're doing is conforming. And conformity doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like agreement. It feels like home. But if everyone claps and no one disagrees, where is the friction? Where is the tension that forces ideas to evolve? Where is the challenge that makes your thoughts sharper? Without it, your mind becomes smooth, polished, dull. You start saying what others say, because it's easier. You start believing what others believe, because it's safer. You stop asking what's true, and start asking what will be accepted. And you begin to lose the distinction between the two. Eventually, the applause becomes internal. You no longer need the crowd. You've absorbed them. Their values, their biases, their fears, they live inside you now. Applauding the right thoughts, silencing the wrong ones. You become your own audience, your own censor. And what dies is the part of you that was willing to risk being wrong. Because being wrong is painful, isolating, embarrassing, but it's also necessary. It's the only path to understanding. It's the only way thinking survives. Without that risk, you're not thinking, you're filtering, performing, echoing. And maybe that's all you've been doing for a while now. Maybe you've forgotten what it feels like to think, in a room where no one claps, where no one agrees, where you're not sure if what you're saying even makes sense yet. But you say it anyway, because you're trying to find out what's real, not what's popular, not what's praised, just what's true. But there's a cost to that. You'll feel the silence again, the unease, the tension in your chest. You'll feel people pull away. You'll wonder if you've made a mistake, if it would have been better to just say what they wanted to hear, to chase the applause, to earn their nods. And maybe it would have felt better, but it wouldn't have been thought, because thinking is lonely. Thinking is quiet. Thinking doesn't clap, and that's why most people stop. Imagine you're in a room, and everyone around you agrees on something you know is wrong. Not think, no. You've seen the evidence, you've done the math, but they don't listen. They laugh, they condescend, they question your sanity. And slowly, without realizing it, you start to question it too. Not because the facts have changed, not because they've made a better argument, but because the weight of being alone is heavier than the weight of being wrong. And then comes the darker part. You find yourself wishing they were wrong in a way that would hurt them. You imagine something happening that would prove you right, something undeniable, irreversible, something painful. You tell yourself it's about justice, but deep down, it's not. It's about relief. You want the discomfort of being isolated to end, even if it means someone gets hurt. It doesn't start as malice. It starts as a craving for certainty, a craving for being seen. But the longer you go unheard, the more the desire grows. And eventually, you would rather see someone suffer than remain the only one who sees the truth. That shift doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up thinking it consciously. It appears in the quiet moments, in small decisions, in passive thoughts. A headline makes you feel vindicated. A disaster gives you a grim satisfaction. You find comfort not in justice, but in being right, no matter the cost. And then something strange happens. You stop looking for truth. You start looking for agreement. And if the truth stands in the way of belonging, you bend it, or you abandon it. You find yourself nodding along to things you know aren't true, just to avoid the silence that comes after disagreement. You tell yourself it's harmless, but what you're really doing is trading reality for approval. Eventually, being right isn't enough. You need others to be wrong and to be punished for it. You need their downfall to justify your discomfort. And if that doesn't happen on its own, you start nudging it along, quietly, indirectly, maybe with a rumor, maybe with a subtle manipulation. Nothing overt, just enough to create distance, just enough to see them stumble. You convince yourself it's deserved. They were arrogant, dismissive. They didn't listen when you tried to explain. But that's not justice either. That's resentment wearing the mask of righteousness. And this is where the bias lives. Not in data or logic, but in the need to feel secure. The need to avoid shame. You begin to twist the world until it confirms your view, no matter how much damage that does. And if the truth won't give you comfort, you create a new one. One where you're right. One where you're justified. One where anyone who disagrees becomes the enemy. And once someone becomes the enemy, anything feels justified. You would rather attack than admit you were wrong. You would rather destroy someone than be left alone in uncertainty. You would rather harm than apologize. Because being wrong feels like death. not just of the idea, but of your place in the world. So you kill, not with violence usually, but with words, with silence, with withdrawal, with alignment to those who will validate your story. And the more people you bring to your side, the less you have to feel the sting of being mistaken. But that's the illusion, because none of it brings peace. It only brings more dependence, more fragility. You become desperate for reinforcement. You need to be right more and more often, just to keep the discomfort away. You stop listening. You stop learning. You stop growing. And eventually you're no longer defending truth. You're defending yourself from shame, from doubt, from the unbearable feeling that you might be the only one who doesn't see it clearly. And in that moment, you become dangerous. Because a person who fears being wrong more than they fear harming others will always find a reason to hurt someone, quietly, justifiably, in the name of certainty. And all the while, they'll tell themselves they're just doing what's right. Imagine a child lost in the woods, alone, starving, crying. Now imagine you hear about it on the news, faceless, distant, another story in the background of your day. You care, but not enough to stop what you're doing, not enough to feel it. But if you saw their face, mud-streaked cheeks, wide, terrified eyes, lips cracked from thirst, something changes. Now it's real. Now you ache. Now you want to help. So what was missing before? You didn't see the face, and without it, your morality stayed dormant, still there, but quiet, detached. This is the strange fragility of how we decide what matters. The suffering we ignore isn't always hidden. It's just faceless. It happens in statistics, in headlines, in numbers too large to hold. 10,000 dead, 1 million displaced. You hear those words and nothing moves inside you. But show one face, one story, one moment of human detail, and your entire body shifts. That's not logic. That's not reason. That's something else. And it raises a question you probably don't want to answer. Is your morality real if it depends on whether you can picture the victim? You like to think of yourself as principled, ethical, consistent. But what happens to those principles when the person in need is anonymous? What happens when the face is blurry? You say you'd never let someone suffer if you could help. But there are people suffering right now whose pain you know about. You know what country they're in, what disaster struck them, what injustice they're facing. But you don't know what they look like. You don't know their name. And so somehow it feels less urgent, less real. You wait for stories that make it personal. You wait for images that break your heart. Until then you keep scrolling. But morality that waits for emotion isn't morality. It's empathy masquerading as ethics. And empathy is unreliable. It fades with distance. It shrinks when the details disappear. Worse still, it's selective. You cry for a dog beaten in a video, but not for 100 factory workers crushed by policy. You weep for one child on a beach, but feel nothing for thousands dying the same way, quietly, out of frame. Not because you don't care, but because your brain doesn't know how. It wasn't built to care about numbers. It was built to recognize faces. And that means your morality, the thing you trust to guide your actions, isn't a compass. It's a mirror. It reflects what you're close to, what you see. And everything else stays outside your line of sight. Now imagine something worse. What if someone knows this about you? What if they understand that showing a face gets your attention, and hiding it erases guilt? How easy would it be to manipulate your sense of right and wrong? Hide the victims, blur the images, keep the suffering out of frame, and you'll feel nothing. Not because you're evil, but because your moral system has a blind spot. And what if you've already been trained to ignore certain faces? Faces that don't look like yours. Faces from places you've learned to dismiss. What if your empathy doesn't just shrink with distance? It warps with difference. It's not something you want to believe, but look honestly. Whose pain affects you? Whose fear do you understand? Whose death makes you pause? And whose doesn't? The moment morality depends on recognition, it becomes fragile. Because recognition is easy to withhold. Blur the face, change the language, shift the narrative, and suddenly the same suffering no longer feels the same. It doesn't feel like anything at all. And then you're left with a haunting realization. Maybe the reason you're able to sleep at night isn't because there's no horror. It's because the horror is hidden. Or worse, made ordinary. A bomb drops. A family dies. But there's no face, no name. Just smoke, just numbers, just noise. And so you go on with your day. Not because you're heartless, but because your morality failed the moment it needed a face to function. And if that's true, then how many times has your silence been complicity? How many decisions have you made that felt neutral but weren't? How many wrongs have you accepted, not because you agreed with them, but because they were faceless enough to forget? That's the discomfort you don't want to sit with. Not that you're cruel, but that your kindness has limits you never chose. Limits shaped by visibility, by familiarity, by ease. And now you can't unsee it. You can't unknow that the boundaries of your moral concern are drawn, not by justice, but by proximity, not by principle, but by image. And everything outside that narrow field of view, everything blurry, distant or different, disappears, only from you. Why do you feel closer to someone after they confess the same mistake you've made? Not just any mistake, the kind you hide, the kind that lives at the edge of shame. The moment you hear them admit it, even softly, something shifts. Not just relief, not just understanding, something deeper. You feel safe. But why? You didn't become less guilty. The mistake still happened. Nothing changed, except that now someone else is holding the same weight. They've fallen too, and somehow that makes you trust them more. It doesn't matter if you should. It doesn't matter if they're trustworthy in any rational sense. What matters is that they admitted it. And in that moment, you feel less alone, less strange, less broken. You want to believe this is empathy, that you're recognizing shared humanity. But look more closely. The trust you feel, it isn't really about them. It's about you, about how much you needed to hear that your failure wasn't just yours, that you're not the only one who got it wrong. If they made the same mistake, maybe the mistake isn't that bad. If they're still standing, maybe you can be too. Their confession doesn't just make them feel more human. It rescues your image of yourself, and so you trust them, not because of who they are, but because of what their mistake gives you. Relief, permission, escape from isolation. But think about what that means. You're not trusting them because they've proven themselves. You're trusting them because they've mirrored you. They've made the same moral compromise, the same bad choice, the same lapse in judgment. And because of that, you see them as honest. Even if they're not, you don't ask whether their mistake hurt someone. You don't examine the details. You just feel closer, safer, because they're like you. And now, something more disturbing emerges. Maybe this isn't empathy at all. Maybe it's a bias, a reflex. Maybe the brain is wired to equate similarity with trust, even when it's built on failure, even when it's dangerous. People don't bond over perfection. They bond over shared imperfection. But that also means you might trust someone more just because they admit to doing something wrong, something you've done too, even if they've never earned your trust in any other way. So what happens when someone wants your trust? What happens if they know your history, your guilt, your secret shame? Could they mirror it back to you on purpose? Could they tell you exactly what you need to hear, not because they share it, but because they know it will lower your guard? What if their mistake is just bait? And how would you know? You'd feel the same wave of recognition, the same warmth. You'd feel safe, even if the entire thing was a lie, because your trust wouldn't be based on truth. It would be based on pattern matching, on the brain's desperate need to feel less alone in guilt. You might forgive someone more easily if they remind you of yourself. You might overlook something serious just because it resonates. Not because it's right, just because it's familiar. And now the trap is clear. The people who mirror your failures might not be confessing, they might be manipulating. But because you need the connection so badly, you won't question it. You'll feel grateful. You'll open up. You'll trust them. You might even defend them. Because to reject them would mean rejecting the part of yourself they mirrored. And maybe that's the real danger. It's not that they lied, it's that you needed the lie to feel okay. He's lying on the ground. He's injured, maybe dying. You can see the way he struggles to lift his head, the shallow pull of his breath, the blood darkening his shirt. It's not subtle, it's not hidden. And yet, no one moves. 5 people stand nearby, calm, unbothered. Their faces are relaxed, even slightly bored. They glance down at him and look away, like it's nothing. So you don't move either. You keep your hands in your pockets. You tell yourself there's probably more to the story, that if something were really wrong, someone else would have done something already. You feel the tension in your body, but you look around and no one else is tense, so you doubt it. You feel concern, but you suppress it. You trust the crowd more than your own instinct. And that's how people die. Not because no one cared, but because everyone thought someone else would act. And no one wanted to be the one to break the illusion of normal. This is the bystander effect. You've heard of it, but it's not just about emergencies. It's about how easily you give up responsibility when others appear calm, how quickly you silence your own alarm bells if no one else seems alarmed. You imagine yourself as someone who would step forward, speak up, act decisively. But when the moment comes, your eyes look sideways, scanning for reassurance. And if you find it, even in silence, even in inaction, you convince yourself there's nothing to be done. There's a comfort in conformity, a deep safety in doing what everyone else does. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like absence, like drifting. But it's a decision all the same, a choice to value harmony over urgency, to mirror calm rather than confront chaos. And the most dangerous part, you don't notice you're doing it. You don't say, "I won't help." You say, "It's probably fine." You don't think, "Let him die." You think, "Someone else knows better." You outsource your judgment to the group, then call it objectivity. But if 5 people look calm while one person is dying, what does that say about the 5? What does it say about you? Maybe you think they know something you don't. Maybe you assume they have more information, more experience, more clarity, so you defer to them. But what if they're doing the exact same thing, looking at each other, waiting, pretending nothing is wrong? Then all of you are trapped in the same silent performance, each one reinforcing the other's illusion, each one strengthening the lie. This isn't about emergencies, it's about everyday moments, the colleague being mistreated, the stranger who's clearly upset, the wrong that everyone sees but no one names. You wait, you watch, you match the group's mood, and that quiet, collective calm becomes a cage. You aren't indifferent, you're uncertain. But uncertainty feels shameful when everyone else seems sure, so you hide it. And in hiding it, you help maintain the illusion. You think you're not responsible. You think you didn't choose. But your silence is a choice. Your stillness is a choice. Your refusal to disrupt the calm is an act that protects the calm and nothing else. What if the 5 others were actors? What if they were told to remain calm, no matter what? Would you still trust their silence over your own eyes? Would you still do nothing while someone lay dying? What if they weren't even real? The point isn't that you failed. The point is that you never really decided. You handed the decision to the group, and the group did the same to you. And together, you created a story in which nobody was guilty, just passive, quiet, well-meaning. And someone died inside that story. Not because the danger wasn't visible, but because the calm was contagious. And now you have to wonder, how many times have you done this already? How many moments have passed where your instinct said, do something, and your eyes said, wait and see? How many people were ignored, dismissed, left alone because the group stayed silent? You think you're the kind of person who would act, but your actions don't come from you. They come from what you see others doing. You calibrate your response to theirs. You don't even realize it. And the most disturbing part, if you saw the same situation again, you'd probably do the same thing, unless someone else acted first, unless someone broke the calm. But what if no one ever does? What if all of you are waiting on each other, forever? Then people keep dying, quietly, invisibly, while everyone stands still, watching everyone else not move. And you're one of them. You are always one of them. You're convinced something happened to you. You remember it clearly. The sensation, the panic, the weight in your chest. You can describe it in detail. The moment it began, the way your body reacted, how long it lasted. You've replayed it 1,000 times, like a loop burned into your mind. A moment of pain, of fear, of something breaking inside you. You remember it, but then someone tells you it never happened. They show you proof, no records, no evidence. No one else remembers it. The place where it happened doesn't exist. The people you recall weren't there. They say you must be mistaken. Maybe you dreamed it. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe your mind created it. But it felt real. That's where the tension starts, not in the pain itself, but in the doubt. You begin to question your own mind. If it didn't happen, why does it hurt? Why does the memory return involuntarily, as if carved into you? Why do you flinch when you remember it? If it wasn't real, you try to rationalize. Maybe it was something similar. Maybe the details blurred over time. Maybe it wasn't false, just misfiled, distorted. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to face. What if your mind didn't just blur the memory, but invented it entirely? Not to deceive you, not to trick you, but to protect you. Because sometimes your mind creates pain for reasons you can't access. It fills in blanks, invents trauma, constructs stories around invisible wounds. Not because you're broken, but because your brain is trying to make sense of something it can't explain. A loneliness you couldn't name, a fear you weren't allowed to feel, an emptiness you never understood. Pain with no clear source is intolerable. So the mind gives it shape. It creates a memory, a scene, a moment, a reason, not because it's real, but because having a reason hurts less than having none. And once the memory is there, it becomes indistinguishable from the truth. You don't remember where you heard it. You don't recall when it started. But the story becomes part of you, and you defend it. Because without it, you're left with raw confusion, with pain that has no beginning, no context, no meaning, and that's worse. You start to wonder how many of your memories are real, Not just this one, but others. Did that person really say what you remember? Did that event unfold the way you've told it? Over and over. You trust your memory. It's all you have. But it's soft, changeable, suggestible. And yet, it feels solid. Emotionally, it's absolute. That's the trick. Memory doesn't just recall events, it creates them. Every time you remember something, you slightly alter it. You add details, lose others, emphasize what matters most. Over time, what you remember becomes less about what happened and more about what you needed to believe happened. And sometimes, that belief is pain. You think you're remembering a wound, but you might be remembering a story you needed to explain the wound. A story that never happened, a pain that never occurred, and yet it still shapes you, still controls how you move, how you relate, how you protect yourself from what might happen again. So what happens when the pain is real, but the memory is false? What happens when your body carries the scars of something your mind invented? You try to dismiss it. You tell yourself it's all in your head. That's supposed to make it feel smaller, but it doesn't. Because in your head isn't the same as imaginary. Your mind is your reality. If your brain tells you to flinch, your body obeys. If it tells you to panic, you will. If it shows you pain, you feel it. So even if the source was false, the impact isn't. You try to fix it. Therapy, reflection, self-examination. You peel back layers, looking for the origin. You ask yourself, again and again, what really happened? What's true? What's invented? But the line blurs so completely that it dissolves. And you're left with a strange truth. It doesn't matter whether it happened. What matters is that you believe it did, and that belief has consequences. You avoid certain people, certain places, certain words. You defend yourself from ghosts. You shape your identity around wounds that may never have existed. And still, it feels honest, because the pain is real. The memory might be fake, but the pain is real. You start to understand that your life isn't just shaped by what happened to you. It's shaped by what you believe happened to you. And if your beliefs are flawed, biased, or fabricated, your reality follows. And that's the most unsettling part. Because it means your suffering might come, not from the world, but from inside you. From the stories your brain told to make sense of the world. Stories you never chose, but accepted. Stories you've built your life around. And now you have to live with the possibility that your deepest wounds might be echoes of nothing. Painful memories of things that never were, and yet, somehow, still are. What if being good wasn't what you were really after? What if the rush came not from doing the right thing, but from watching someone else see you do it? You're in a room, someone drops their wallet. You notice, no one else does. For a moment, it's just you, the wallet. And the decision, you could return it silently. No praise, no recognition. Just a quiet choice made in private. But then someone turns, sees you pick it up, and suddenly everything changes. Now there's a witness. Now your action means something. Not just to you, but to them. You hand the wallet back, and they smile. They say thank you. Maybe others notice too. Maybe they see you as kind, as honest, as good. And that feels better than you expected. Not because you did the right thing, but because you were seen doing it, noticed, praised, maybe admired, even if only for a moment. And then something small happens inside you. Something shifts. You want that feeling again. You tell yourself you're just trying to be a better person. But are you? Or are you chasing that recognition? That rush of approval? That warm glow of being seen? It's easy to believe they're the same. That being seen as good and being good are aligned, but they aren't. One requires sacrifice. The other often doesn't. One is invisible, the other depends entirely on being noticed. You start offering help more often, but only when someone's watching. You post about your kindness online, about the causes you support, the people you defend. You amplify your virtue, frame it just right, make sure it lands. You start to notice how certain good deeds feel empty when no one else sees them, like they don't count, like they barely happened. And slowly, being seen as good becomes the goal, because it's addictive. The praise, the validation, the identity it builds. You become someone people admire, trust, celebrate. And once you've felt that, the thought of being seen as anything less becomes unbearable. You begin curating your image, not your actions, your image. You filter out the parts of yourself that don't fit, hide your pettiness, your anger, your indifference. You say the right things, like the right posts, condemn the right villains, not because you feel it deeply, but because you know it will be seen. You shared, approved. And now you're not just performing goodness, you're dependent on the performance. You need it to feel real. Without the audience, without the reaction, you don't know who you are anymore. The discomfort grows when you're alone. You wonder, if no one ever saw me do something good again, would I still do it? If there were no likes, no praise, no applause, just silence, would I keep trying? You start to fear the answer. You think about the moments when doing the right thing would cost you something, your reputation, your status, your comfort. Would you still act, even if it made you look weak, or cruel, or selfish? Even if it ruined the image you've spent so long building, and then it hits you. The version of you that the world admires might not be good at all, just careful, strategic, addicted to appearances, terrified of being seen differently. You think back to the wallet. If no one had turned, if no one had seen, would you still have picked it up? You want to say yes. But the longer you sit with the question, the quieter your certainty becomes. And maybe that silence says more than you want it to. You tell a lie. It comes out fast, smooth, maybe even necessary. You say it to avoid conflict, to protect someone's feelings, to make yourself look better. Maybe it's a small lie, barely a shift from the truth. Or maybe it's something bigger, something that rearranges a whole memory, changes how someone sees you. In the moment, it feels justified, reasonable, even right. But then someone questions it, gently, casually, or maybe not so gently. They point out an inconsistency, a fact that doesn't fit, a memory that doesn't line up, and something strange happens. You don't admit the truth, you double down, you reinforce the lie, you make it stronger, more detailed, more convincing. Not because it's true, but because you said it first. Something in your brain resists the idea that you could be wrong or dishonest or caught. And so it begins. A quiet war between your memory and your pride, between accuracy and identity. And almost always, identity wins. This isn't about deception anymore. It's about self-preservation. You defend the lie because to admit it was a lie would mean rewriting who you are, even if just a little. It would mean facing the fact that you misled someone, that you made a choice you now regret, that you're not who you want to be. And that's not easy. So instead, you commit, you adjust your memory to match the lie. You convince yourself it was true all along. You find justifications, rationalizations, explanations that smooth the edges and fill the gaps. You stop seeing it as a lie at all. You believe in it now, fully. This is what psychologists call consistency bias. The tendency to reshape past beliefs to align with present actions, to smooth out contradiction, to preserve a clean, coherent narrative of who you are. But here's what makes it so dangerous. You don't notice it happening. You think you're being honest. You think you remember it clearly. But all you've done is protect the first version of the story, the one you happened to tell out loud. That version becomes sacred, not because it's true, but because it's yours. And over time, this creates a subtle kind of corruption. You stop questioning your own memories. You defend them, not because they're accurate, but because they feel safe. You refuse correction, not because you know you're right, but because being wrong would unravel too much. It would expose the fragile scaffolding you've built around your own identity. So you fight for the lie. You argue. You get angry. You accuse others of remembering incorrectly. You make the issue about them, their doubt, their misunderstanding, their bad intentions, anything to keep from turning inward and asking the harder question, why are you so afraid of being wrong? You might tell yourself it's about trust, that people should believe you, that your version deserves respect, but deep down you know it isn't about them at all. It's about fear. The fear of collapsing a part of yourself. The fear that admitting you lied, no matter how small, might mean you are a liar. And so to avoid that possibility, you let the lie become part of you. It shapes your actions. It informs your judgments. It becomes a reference point for other choices. You lie again to support it. You build around it, layer by layer, until it's indistinguishable from your truth. And now you're trapped, because even if someone proves it, shows you evidence, recordings, undeniable facts, you still resist. You say they misunderstood. You claim there's more context. You question their motives. Not because you're evil or manipulative or cruel, but because your brain is trying to protect you from the unbearable reality that you might be wrong in a way that matters. You feel it as a threat, not to your reputation, but to your self-image, to your internal sense of coherence. And your brain will do almost anything to protect that, even lie, especially lie. And here's the hardest part. It doesn't feel like lying anymore. It feels like defending yourself. It feels like standing up for your truth. But it isn't truth. It's just inertia. The force of having spoken first. The cost of having said something out loud before you were ready to face what it really meant. So now you live inside it. You wear the lie like armor, not because it protects you from others, but because it protects you from yourself. It spares you from the quiet, unsettling moment of realizing that sometimes your words create your reality rather than reflect it. And that once you've said something, it becomes very hard to let it go, even if it was never true to begin with. And maybe the worst part is this: you'll never fully know which parts of yourself were built this way, which beliefs you hold now because they were true, and which you hold simply because they were yours first. Because once a lie becomes part of your story, it stops feeling like a lie at all. It just feels like who you are. Confidence feels good. You know the feeling when your thoughts align, your voice steadies, and the people around you listen more closely. Something inside rewards you, not for being right, just for being sure. But what if you're wrong? Not slightly, not debatably, but completely, factually, unquestionably wrong. What if your confident belief is false, misleading, even dangerous? The strange part is, your brain still rewards you. The same feeling of certainty, the same chemical reinforcement. You feel right, even when you're not. It's not a flaw in thinking. It's a feature of the mind. The brain doesn't always wait for truth. It rewards clarity, decisiveness, and self-assurance because those traits were once signs of survival. A confident leader, even if mistaken, could hold a group together, could convince others to act, could outlast doubt. Hesitation, on the other hand, feels weak, untrustworthy, even when it's more accurate. You've probably felt this conflict before. Moments when someone spoke with so much conviction that you doubted your own uncertainty. They weren't more informed, just more sure, and your brain reacted, not to evidence, but to confidence. This happens inside you too. Sometimes you start to believe your own certainty, not because you've verified it, but because your brain rewards the sensation of being right, the surge of dopamine, the calm that comes with confidence, the internal approval that says, yes, this makes sense, keep going. But when being right and feeling right separate, the consequences can become quiet and lasting. You repeat a false belief because it feels true. You ignore correction because it feels threatening. You push away doubt because it feels uncomfortable. And slowly, your internal world hardens. Not around truth, but around the illusion of knowing. This is how confidence can become self-sustaining. It builds on itself, protects itself, grows stronger each time it's unchallenged. And if someone does challenge you, that feels like an attack, even if it's gentle, even if it's correct. Your brain resists, defends, doubts them before it doubts you. Because being confident doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. And that makes correction hard, almost impossible, because correcting yourself doesn't just mean changing your mind, it means breaking the emotional reward system your brain has built around your certainty. And so the loop continues. A wrong belief, repeated confidently, becomes more emotionally satisfying than a right belief held with doubt. Accuracy becomes secondary. Feeling right takes priority. This is where cognitive bias takes hold, not as a mistake, but as a comfort, a protection, a way to stabilize your sense of self. You tell yourself you're being rational, that your views are based on logic, not emotion. But you feel the unease when someone challenges you, the tension, the quiet defensiveness. That isn't logic. That's the body trying to preserve coherence, to preserve identity. And maybe you've noticed this in others, how easily people cling to confident falsehoods, how quickly they dismiss correction, how their tone grows sharper when their beliefs are questioned. But what you're seeing isn't arrogance, not always. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's the brain gripping onto a belief not because it's true, but because letting it go feels like falling. Because once you admit you are wrong, not just once but repeatedly, you have to face a deeper fear. That your internal compass isn't reliable. That what felt certain yesterday might collapse today. And then you start to see how fragile it all is. How much of your confidence is constructed, not from evidence, but from repetition, emotion, social cues, and the chemical reinforcement of feeling correct. That's the disturbing part. You could be wrong, deeply, dangerously wrong, and your brain could still reward you for it, not just tolerate it. Reward it with calm, with pride, with a sense of moral clarity. And so the wrong belief spreads, gets louder, becomes more convincing, not because it's true, but because it's confident. You see this in history, in politics, in ideology, but most of all in quiet, everyday decisions. Beliefs about yourself, about others, about what's fair, what's possible, what's real. You believe something long enough, with enough certainty, and it becomes harder to imagine any alternative. You don't even notice it happening. You just start trusting your feelings more than facts, your confidence more than correction, your internal reward more than external evidence. And that's when the damage is done. Not loudly, but silently. Not with dramatic lies, but with quiet, confident errors repeated until they feel like truth. until the truth itself feels like a threat, until you realize your brain might not care if you're right. It only cares if you're sure. Would you torture a stranger if the button looked clean enough? Not if it looked like a weapon, not if it resembled a tool of pain, but if it looked ordinary, white, smooth, maybe even soft to the touch. How long would it take before your hesitation disappeared? You're told the stranger is in another room, that pressing the button will cause them pain. You don't hear their screams, you don't see their face, you're just told to press the button. And for each press, you receive something small, a nod of approval, a point on a screen, a tiny reward that means almost nothing, but not quite nothing. You might think you'd never do it, but you're not in pain. You're not being threatened. You're just sitting in a clean room, with no consequences, no visible blood, no moral pressure that feels real. You're just following instructions. You're just playing a game. You tell yourself it doesn't count if you can't see the harm. That if the suffering is hidden, maybe it isn't real. But the real reason you keep pressing isn't confusion. It's detachment. It's the insulation of comfort. Because the button doesn't hurt you. It doesn't demand you witness anything. It just sits there, clean and neutral, waiting to be pressed. And when it clicks, it feels satisfying. That tiny sensation, the response, the sound, the structure, it becomes familiar, rhythmic, easy. You begin to ignore the idea that anything happens on the other side. You start to forget why you hesitated at all. But imagine this. What if the button wasn't clean? What if it was smeared with something? A streak of red, a sharp edge, a trace of human pain. Would you pause then? Would you pull your hand back? And if you would, what does that say about you? That your morality depends not on the pain being caused, but on how visible it is. That what stops you isn't empathy, but mess. Not the violence, but the aesthetics of violence. You might insist that's not true, that your choices come from conscience, not comfort. But if that's the case, why does pain at a distance matter less than pain in front of you? Why do hidden costs feel acceptable, while visible ones paralyze you? Why does suffering become tolerable the moment it becomes abstract? Maybe it's because clean things feel safe, because they don't remind you of consequences, because a clean button lets you lie to yourself. It makes the choice feel controlled, polite, sanitized. Now think about your own life. How many buttons do you press every day? Not literal ones, just choices that lead to unseen harm. Products you buy, companies you support, systems you benefit from. The impact is real, but you don't see it. The button is clean. If you had to witness every consequence, if you had to watch someone suffer, bleed, scream, would you still make the same choices, or would your morality snap into focus only when the evidence became too ugly to ignore? And if so, then what does that mean for your values? That they aren't principles at all, just reactions to discomfort, just habits disguised as ethics. You start to realize something more disturbing, that most systems of harm survive, not because people enjoy causing pain, but because the interface is clean, because the button is smooth, because the consequences are silent. You don't feel evil. You don't even feel involved. You're just doing your job, just living your life, just following orders or rules or instincts. The button does the rest. But imagine now for a moment that someone forces you to see, that they open the door, show you the stranger, reveal the damage. You recognize them. They're not evil. They're not anonymous. They're ordinary, and they're looking at you, trying to understand why you pressed the button so many times. You won't be able to answer, because there is no answer. Only the awful, quiet realization that it was easy, that the interface was too smooth, that the button never asked you to think. And this is the part that stays with you. Not the stranger, not the pain, but how little it took to get you there. How little resistance you offered. How ready you were to believe that if everything around you looked clean, then maybe what you were doing wasn't dirty at all. You'll want to tell yourself it was an experiment, that you were manipulated, that anyone would have done the same. But that doesn't erase the memory of your hand, hovering, then pressing, again and again. Because the most unsettling truth isn't that you caused harm, it's how little you needed to justify it. Just a button, just silence, just comfort. What if you don't panic until you see someone else panic? First, you're in a room, the lights flicker, something feels wrong, but no one moves, no one reacts. So neither do you. You stay seated, still, calm, pretending you're not afraid. Because if no one else is panicking, maybe there's nothing to panic about. And then one person stands, not quickly, just a small, quiet movement. Then another. Their faces tighten. You see it now, the fear, real, contagious. And only then do you feel yours rise. Not because the danger became clearer, but because someone else reacted first. You needed that signal, that permission. You needed proof that fear was appropriate. We like to think of fear as something internal, something we feel in our own bodies, from our own instincts, but much of it doesn't start inside us. It starts when we see it in others. We mirror it, absorb it, sometimes without even realizing. There's a name for this. Social proof, the unconscious bias that tells you if other people are reacting, you should too. If others are calm, stay calm. If they're afraid, start worrying. Even if nothing has changed in the situation itself, you've felt this before. On a plane during turbulence, in a waiting room when test results are delayed, at a stoplight where everyone suddenly starts turning around. You wait, unsure, until you see the expressions around you change. Only then do you decide what's safe, what's dangerous, what's real. And this makes you feel safer, not because the situation is safer, but because you believe you're no longer alone in it. Panic feels manageable if it's shared. Fear becomes valid when it's reflected. But this also means your perception of danger isn't anchored to facts. It's anchored to other people, their body language, their tone, their eyes. And if that's true, how often have you felt calm only because others pretended to be? How often have you ignored risk because everyone else stayed quiet? You think of yourself as rational, as independent. But your fear is social. Your sense of reality is collective. You feel safer when others panic first. Not because that makes the danger clearer, but because it confirms what you were afraid to admit. It lets you believe your fear is justified, that you're not overreacting, that you're responding normally to something real, even if you already knew, deep down, that something was wrong. And here's the quiet trap. If no one panics, you might not either. Even if you should, even if the threat is real. You hesitate, you wait, you need someone else to go first, to fall apart so you're allowed to. Which means your safety isn't really in your hands, it's in theirs. In the people around you, in their willingness to break first, to become the signal you're secretly waiting for. And what happens if no one does? What if the plane is failing and no one screams? What if the fire has started but no one runs? What if the threat is already here and everyone stays still? You might die sitting down, calm, quiet, not because you weren't afraid, but because your fear waited for permission. This is what makes the bias so dangerous. You don't ignore fear, you outsource it. You hand it off to strangers. You let their panic or their silence guide your own. And sometimes they're doing the same thing, waiting for you. So the room stays calm. The threat grows, and everyone sits there, silently scanning each other, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Because no one wants to be the first to panic, to look weak, irrational, embarrassed. We'd rather die pretending to be calm than live, having looked foolish. And now you realize this isn't just about danger. It's about truth. You believe something more easily when you see someone else believe it first. You trust a reaction more when it's not your own. And this is how false certainty spreads. Not from strong beliefs, but from shared silence. Mutual waiting. Group hesitation. You're not alone in your fear, but you're also not leading it. You're following it, even when it leads nowhere. And maybe the most disturbing part is this. The moment you feel safest is the moment you're least alert. When others start to panic, you finally feel like it's okay to do the same. But by then, it might already be too late. Because you weren't reacting to the danger. You were reacting to the reaction. And that small delay, that hesitation to trust yourself, might cost more than fear ever could. They speak quickly. Their words come faster than yours, with no pauses, no searching. Their sentences are fluid, confident, sharp. And you start to feel it, that creeping suspicion that they know something you don't, that they're smarter than you, that somehow the speed of their voice reflects the speed of their mind. It's not something you decided consciously. It happens automatically. You hear them talk, and before you even understand the content, you've already formed a judgment. They're clever, sharp, in control, and your body reacts. You listen more carefully, you defer just slightly, you feel smaller in comparison. But what if that feeling is a trick? What if speed doesn't equal intelligence at all, but your brain is wired to believe it does? You don't notice the trick because it doesn't feel like a trick. It feels like intuition, like common sense. When someone speaks quickly, your mind assumes fluency, competence, mastery. You imagine they've thought these ideas through, that the words come fast because they've already done the work of understanding. But that's not always true. Sometimes they're just good at talking, not thinking. Sometimes they're rehearsing patterns they've used before, moving fast so they don't have to think. Speed can be a defense, a distraction, a mask. And the person who pauses, who stumbles, who searches for the right word, might actually be thinking more carefully than the one who never stops talking. But your brain doesn't see it that way. It rewards the performance. It responds to certainty, not accuracy. When someone speaks with speed and confidence, your mind lowers its defenses. You stop questioning, stop evaluating. You assume understanding where there may be none, and this makes you vulnerable. It means you can be convinced by someone who is wrong just because they sound right. It means you can be led by certainty, even when it's empty. You might trust someone's conclusions, not because of what they say, but how they say it. And that should scare you, because it means your perception of truth isn't anchored in logic or reason. It's shaped by presentation. You believe not what's proven, but what feels persuasive. And you often can't tell the difference. Even now, think about people you admire, politicians, professors, co-workers. How many of them speak quickly? How many speak without hesitation? How many seem intelligent because they don't leave space for doubt? Now think about how you speak. Think about the moments when you slow down, when your mind needs time, when you hesitate before answering, when you pause to reflect. You might worry that you sound unsure, weak, unintelligent. But maybe that's when you're actually thinking. Maybe speed isn't a sign of intelligence. It's just a style. But the world doesn't treat it that way. Fast speakers get more attention, more airtime, more influence. Because people listen to speed, they associate it with energy, command, control. And they often ignore the person who's slower, who's quieter, who takes a moment before responding. That person might be seeing more, feeling more, thinking more, but they get overlooked because they don't play the game of fluency. And so the bias gets stronger. You start to speed up yourself, not because it helps you think, but because it helps you be heard. You try to match their pace, their rhythm. You adapt, perform, simulate. And eventually, you forget what your own voice sounds like when it's not trying to keep up. That voice, the slow one, is the one that thinks. But you start to silence it. You train yourself out of reflection. You replace thought with reaction, substance with fluency, because you're afraid of what the silence will make others think of you. You're afraid of seeming slow. But what if you've misunderstood the fear? What if you're not afraid of being slow? What if you're afraid of being seen? Because when you slow down, people notice, they look closer, they listen differently, and they might hear the uncertainty in your voice. They might see that you don't know for sure, that you're still working it out, and maybe you don't want them to see that. Maybe the real reason fast talkers seem smarter is because they don't give you time to see through them. They keep moving, keep talking, keep performing, and you never get a chance to notice what's missing. But when someone slows down, when they let you in, when they risk pausing, you start to see the whole person. Not just the argument, not just the performance. You see the doubt, the effort, the vulnerability. And maybe that's what real intelligence looks like. Not speed, not certainty, but the courage to think slowly and to be seen doing it. And maybe that's why fast talkers feel smarter, because they never give you the chance to notice that they aren't. What if it didn't happen the way you remember? Not the big events, the job, the breakup, the moment you moved out or made a decision you still think about, but the details, the way people treated you, the way you behaved, what you were trying to do, what you told yourself it meant. Memory isn't a mirror. It's not a camera or a recording. It's a story. And like all stories, it has an author. Someone who chooses the angle, who edits out the parts that don't fit, who makes sure the main character is sympathetic. That author is you. You remember the past as something you survived, something you overcame. You focus on the struggle, the pain, the effort you made to do the right thing. You forget how long you hesitated, how much you avoided, how many people you quietly hurt, how much you wanted to be the victim. You say you were doing your best, that you had no choice. But deep down, you know there were moments, small ones, when you could have acted differently. You could have apologized. You could have told the truth. You could have chosen someone else's well-being over your comfort. You didn't. And now those moments are gone, absorbed into a cleaner narrative. One where your mistakes are reasonable. Your selfishness is understandable. Your silence is wise. You remember things in a way that makes you feel like a good person, even if you weren't, because that's what memory is for. It protects you from shame, from regret, from the slow realization that your life wasn't just shaped by what happened to you, but by what you did to others. It shields you from the truth that you weren't just a victim of circumstance. You were sometimes the cause, and this isn't rare. This isn't some defect in you. Everyone edits their past. Everyone shapes their story, not because they're evil or dishonest, but because facing the raw, unfiltered truth would be unbearable. The version you tell yourself is the only one you can live with, but that version isn't harmless. Because when you believe a flattering lie about your past, you carry it into the present. You cling to an identity that isn't real. You excuse behaviors that should have changed. You blame people who might have been right to walk away. You think you're protecting yourself from pain. But what you're really doing is protecting the version of you that never grows. The one who was always justified, always misunderstood, always trying their best. no matter the outcome. You think this version makes you stronger, but it just makes you blind. And there are moments, quiet ones, when the truth tries to return. When someone says something that doesn't match your memory. When you see yourself in someone else's behavior and feel a flicker of recognition. When a dream or a stray thought brings back something you'd forgotten, something small but sharp and real. You dismiss it quickly. You move on. But part of you wonders. Part of you knows. The story you tell yourself isn't quite right. It never was. You say it doesn't matter now. It's in the past. You've changed. But if you've changed, why can't you face it? Why does the truth still feel dangerous? Maybe because deep down you're not sure you've changed. Not in the way you want to believe. Not in the way that matters. Maybe the only thing that's changed is the story. And now you live inside that story. It feels solid, familiar, safe. But something underneath it stays unsettled. A quiet dissonance. A tension you can't explain. Because somewhere deep down, you know the truth didn't disappear. It just went quiet. And one day, it might return. Not in a dramatic revelation, but slowly, in the way you react to criticism. In the way you treat someone who reminds you of the person you used to be. In the way you defend yourself before anyone has even accused you. That's how the truth returns. Not as memory, but as behavior. And the question you'll have to ask yourself then isn't about the past. It's about the present. About whether you still need the story. About whether you're ready to see yourself clearly. Because the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They're the ones we live inside for years. And the scariest part isn't realizing the story was false. It's realizing how much of your life was built to protect it. Imagine being wrong and not even knowing it. Not because the evidence wasn't there, not because the truth was hidden, but because you never looked. You didn't want to look. You were certain. And that felt safer. Think about a belief you hold with confidence. Anything. Maybe it's political. Maybe it's personal. Maybe it's about someone you love. Now imagine someone tells you, gently, carefully, that you're wrong. Not to hurt you, not to shame you, but to help. They show you the evidence. They ask you to reconsider. But something happens inside you. Your mind closes, tightens, pushes back. Not because the evidence is weak, but because your certainty feels more important than being correct. It's not that you lied to yourself. It's that the lie was easier to hold than the truth. Certainty gives you direction, identity, safety. It gives you something to stand on. The truth, on the other hand, might shift everything beneath you. You think you want to know what's real. You think you want to be right. But when those things come with discomfort, when they require you to change your mind, admit failure, or lose face, you suddenly realize how much you are protecting something else. Your confidence, your stability, your pride. You've probably done it without noticing. Argued too hard over something you didn't fully understand. Dismissed new information because it made you feel foolish. Held on to a belief just long enough to avoid admitting you were wrong in front of someone else. In those moments, correctness wasn't the goal. Certainty was. Even if it meant distorting what was true. There's a quiet mechanism behind this. A cognitive bias so deeply woven into how we think, we barely see it. Psychologists call it belief perseverance. Once you've accepted something as true, it takes far more to dislodge it than it ever took to believe it in the first place. Even when shown clear, contradictory evidence, your mind fights back. Not with reason, but with resistance. And it's not because you're irrational. It's because being wrong feels like a threat. A threat to your intelligence, your sense of control, your place in the world. Certainty becomes armor. Even if the truth is sharper, heavier, more real, you'd rather carry the lie because the lie is familiar. It fits. This bias doesn't just affect your opinions, it shapes your memory. It alters your perception of events. You'll remember facts that support your view and forget the ones that don't. You'll surround yourself with people who agree with you, not because you fear debate, but because agreement feels like safety, like confirmation that you were right all along. But here's the disturbing part. The more certain you feel, the more likely you are to be wrong. Confidence and correctness don't rise together. They often move in opposite directions. The loudest voice in the room isn't the wisest. It's the one most afraid of silence. And when you double down on certainty, you lose something. You lose the ability to learn. You trade curiosity for control. Doubt becomes the enemy. Humility becomes weakness. And slowly, without noticing, you become trapped inside a worldview that can't be questioned. Not because it's right, but because it's yours. Now, imagine this plays out over years. You build a life around certain truths about who you are, what people are like, what the world is. And then one day something cracks. You realize a belief you held tightly, defended fiercely, was wrong. Not a little wrong, deeply, painfully wrong. The kind of wrong that reshapes your past, that forces you to look at yourself differently. What do you do then? Do you let the truth in? Do you sit with the shame, the regret, the humiliation? Or do you retreat into certainty again? Tell yourself it was an exception, a misunderstanding, a trick. Because being correct means nothing if you can't live with what it reveals. You might think this is rare, that most people, most of the time, are open to truth. But the reality is quieter, more subtle. It's not that we avoid truth deliberately. It's that we stop looking when we feel certain. We stop asking questions. We stop noticing contradictions. And slowly, our certainty builds walls that truth can't enter. Even now, you might be thinking of someone else, someone rigid, stubborn, refusing to see what's obvious. But pause. Ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind? Not about something small, but about something foundational, something that made you uncomfortable. And if you can't remember, why is that? The most dangerous beliefs aren't the ones that are wrong. They're the ones you won't examine, the ones that feel too important, too central, too sacred to question. Those are the beliefs that shape you. And if they're false, then part of you is false too. That's the price of certainty. You get to feel safe, but you might never know who you really are. Why is it that you agree with so many people, but still feel like no one really understands you? It's a strange kind of loneliness, subtle, quiet, and constant. You scroll through opinions that match yours, laugh at the same jokes, share the same outrage. You find comfort in knowing others feel the way you do, but somehow that comfort doesn't last. The moment the conversation ends, the silence feels heavier than before. It's not just that you're alone, it's that you still feel unknown. You believe your thoughts are your own, that your values, your preferences, your instincts are yours because you chose them. But most of what you think didn't come from you. It came from the people around you. Not all at once, and not obviously, bit by bit. Unconsciously, you absorbed what was acceptable, what was expected, what was rewarded. You were shaped by nods of approval, subtle disapproval, likes, shares, the quiet punishment of indifference. Slowly, without noticing, your beliefs began to match your surroundings. Not because they were right, but because they felt safe. And now when you think, you're not really thinking alone. You're rehearsing group norms. You're echoing ideas that feel familiar, validated, and predictable. You form opinions not from deep reflection, but from internalized patterns, what your group allows you to say, what your group expects you to feel. But your emotions don't always follow. And that's where the gap begins. You might agree with the anger, but not feel it. You might share the sadness, but still feel hollow. Or worse, you might feel something different, something not allowed. And when that happens, you don't speak. You bury it, you smile, nod, post the right thing. Because the fear of emotional dissonance is stronger than your need for honesty. You start to live in two realities. One shaped by the collective voice in your head, loud, certain, ever present. The other, quiet and private, where doubt lives, where confusion waits, where emotions exist that you're not sure are acceptable. You begin to feel like a stranger among people who agree with you. And the strangest part is that they probably feel the same. Everyone trying to match the tone. Everyone trying to stay aligned. Everyone secretly afraid of saying the wrong thing, not to avoid punishment, but to avoid being seen as different, unclear, emotionally misaligned. You perform certainty to hide your uncertainty. You perform emotion to hide your numbness. And so does everyone else. The result is a kind of collective dishonesty that no one talks about, but everyone senses. You're surrounded by people who think like you, but you still feel disconnected, not because you're too different, but because the part of you that doesn't fit is the part you're not allowed to show. It's not just loneliness, it's isolation in plain sight. It's the ache of realizing that the version of you who feels doubt, complexity, contradiction has no safe place to exist. That version of you is edited out, smoothed over, replaced with consensus. And the longer this goes on, the more you forget where your voice ends and the group begins. You start to feel hollow even in agreement, because agreement is no longer a choice. It's a requirement, a default setting you didn't choose, but can't easily escape. You don't know how to unthink what you've absorbed. You don't know if your opinions are yours or just borrowed signals from the collective. And even when you're surrounded by validation, the loneliness grows, because part of you knows the truth, that you're not really connected, you're synchronized. But synchronization is not intimacy. It doesn't make you known, it makes you repeatable. And deep down, you don't want to be repeatable, you want to be real. But you're afraid that if you let that happen, if you speak what you truly feel, think what you truly think, you'll be alone in a way that's even worse. Because it's one thing to feel alone while fitting in. It's another to feel alone because you no longer do. What if the most honest version of you is the one no one else ever sees? Not the version at work, with its careful tone. Not the version among friends, with its familiar habits. Not even the version with family, where the roles are old and fixed. But the one that emerges in a locked room, when your phone is off, the door is closed, and there's no one to impress, no one to perform for. The version that speaks in your thoughts, uninterrupted. The version you never have to explain. There's a shift that happens when you believe no one is watching. Not immediately, but gradually. Your posture loosens. Your smile disappears. You stop editing your reactions. Stop rehearsing your words. What you want becomes clearer. What you resent surfaces. And somewhere in that space, a different kind of truth begins to form. Not the kind of truth you tell others, but the kind you finally tell yourself. It doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks petty. You admit things you normally deny. You think things that feel wrong, but you don't stop them. You imagine arguments you'd never have the courage to start, and victories you'd never earn in real life. You catch yourself lingering on failures you pretend not to care about, or quietly fantasizing about success you'd publicly dismiss. When no one's watching, your principles get quiet and your impulses grow louder. And that's uncomfortable because it suggests your public self isn't a mask you wear for others. It's a mask you also wear for yourself. You've built a version of you that feels more acceptable, more reasonable, more controlled. But it's built through friction. Every time you suppress a thought, deny a feeling, avoid a reaction, you reinforce the performance. The real version gets buried beneath what you think you should be. You tell yourself the difference doesn't matter, that the you that shows up in the world is the real one, because it's the one that acts. But if the core of you only appears when no one is watching, then maybe the self you trust is the one you keep hidden. Maybe the person you become in private isn't the outlier, it's the original. That idea isn't flattering. It doesn't align with how you want to see yourself. We like to believe our values hold steady in all conditions, that we're just as kind when no one notices, just as disciplined when no one rewards us, just as ethical when no one punishes us. But most people aren't. Most people bend. They cut corners in private that they judge in others. They say things behind closed doors they'd never admit in public. They excuse their worst thoughts with quiet justifications, the kind only they can hear. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just cowardly. Sometimes it's the unwillingness to confront something difficult. You delay a conversation you know you should have. You keep a secret you know you shouldn't. You hold on to bitterness because letting go would mean admitting you were wrong, or that the other person never will be. And because no one sees this, you convince yourself it doesn't count. You keep the appearance clean, so you feel clean. But the longer you do this, the more hollow that surface becomes. You start to feel the disconnect. The performance wears thin, and every now and then, in moments of stillness, the buried parts rise up again. There's no one to confront you but yourself. No one to call you out. No one to ask why your actions drift from your beliefs. But you feel it anyway. A quiet sense of fraudulence. A knowledge that you're not entirely who you say you are. And that knowledge doesn't go away. It lingers. Maybe that's why people seek distraction so desperately. Not because they're bored, but because they're afraid of who they become in silence. When the noise dies down and the audience disappears and the performance ends, they're left alone with a version of themselves they don't quite recognize and don't really want to. And yet, that version is still you. Still thinking, still choosing, still revealing. The one who shows up in the mirror when you're too tired to pretend. The one who narrates your thoughts before you have a chance to shape them into something polite. The one who doesn't lie, not because it's virtuous, but because there's no reason to lie when no one else is listening. It's not about shame. It's not about guilt. It's about the quiet realization that honesty is conditional, that truth for most people is situational. That the way we talk about ourselves is carefully curated and always incomplete. So what do you do with that? What happens when you realize that your most honest moments are also your most private? Do you hide them deeper, pretend they don't exist? Or do you look closer, not to punish, but to understand? Because maybe the real danger isn't what you do when no one's watching, but how long you've been pretending that version of you doesn't matter. How long you've convinced yourself that it isn't real, even though it always was, and still is, and never stopped watching you back. Would you feel as guilty if everyone else said it was the right thing to do? Imagine you've done something wrong, something you'd normally regret. You know it crossed a line. You feel the heaviness of it in your chest. But then, the people around you say it was justified, that you had no choice, that anyone else in your position would have done the same. You hear their voices, calm and certain, and slowly something shifts inside you. You still remember what you did, but the shame doesn't burn as much. The guilt, once sharp, begins to soften. You tell yourself it's because you understand it better now, because others have helped you see the bigger picture. But maybe that isn't the full story. Maybe it's just easier to let go of guilt when you're not holding it alone. This isn't always conscious, it happens quietly. Gradually, the more people echo your justification, the more distance you feel from the act itself. The memory dulls, the pain fades. What felt unforgivable begins to seem complicated, maybe even necessary. You might not even notice the moment your certainty shifts. You still say you feel bad. You still call it a mistake. But the emotional weight doesn't match the words anymore. And when someone questions you, really questions you, you feel more annoyed than ashamed. Because you thought this was already settled. You thought this guilt had already been dissolved by consensus. Now imagine the opposite. You make a choice that felt reasonable at the time. But afterward, no one agrees. They look at you differently. They ask hard questions. They don't let it go. You replay the moment over and over, even if it wasn't that serious. Even if, logically, you did what you had to do. Because no one else is helping carry the burden. And without their agreement, the guilt begins to grow, to spread, to settle in deeper than it otherwise might. You tell yourself you're just being reflective, that you're holding yourself accountable. But what you're really feeling is isolation. You're not just guilty, you're alone in it. That's the part we rarely talk about. That guilt isn't only about the morality of the act. It's also about how alone we are. Afterward, the more people share our justifications, the easier it becomes to believe them. The more hands around our decision, the less blood we see on our own. We don't erase the past, we just redistribute the responsibility. And the weight gets lighter. But does that mean the act was any less wrong? That's where things get uncomfortable. Because you start to wonder if guilt is really moral at all, or if it's just emotional. Relational, dependent on how people respond to you, not what you actually did. And if that's true, if your guilt can shrink just because others say it should, then what is it really? Not justice, not integrity, not some objective reckoning with right and wrong. Just a feeling, one that can be negotiated, diluted, or even erased if the social conditions are right. And this realization doesn't just affect how you view your past, it changes how you navigate the future. When you face a hard decision now, you don't just ask what's right, you ask what others will say. You anticipate the fallout, the conversations, the judgment or lack of it. And without realizing it, your moral compass starts to bend, not toward truth, but toward consensus. You might not notice it happening. You might still think you're following your conscience, but if guilt fades faster with agreement, then maybe your conscience isn't as private as you think. Maybe it's a group project. And maybe in some cases that makes you more dangerous, not less. Because if enough people agree, you can justify anything. And if they don't, even the smallest mistake can haunt you for years. So the real question isn't whether your actions were justified. It's whether you'd still believe they were if no one else agreed. If everyone else turned away. If every voice but your own called it wrong. Would the guilt stay then? Or does it only return when you're the last one left, defending it? And what does that say about the choices you haven't made yet? About the things you haven't done? Not because they're wrong, but because you're not sure how others would respond. It's not just guilt that fades, it's fear, doubt, restraint. And maybe the most dangerous moment isn't when you feel alone in your guilt. It's when you feel completely safe in your certainty, because everyone else agrees. Would you let a friend fail just to avoid looking like a fool? Imagine you're in a room, surrounded by people you respect. A plan is unfolding, a presentation, a pitch, a group decision. Your friend is speaking confidently, explaining an idea you both talked about. But as the words leave their mouth, you realize they've misunderstood something critical. They're getting it wrong. And everyone is listening. You have a choice. You could speak up, clarify the mistake, take the hit together. But that would mean admitting your part in it, revealing that you didn't catch it earlier, that you were wrong too, that you weren't paying close enough attention. If you stay silent, your friend takes the fall alone. You look competent. You stay safe. And so, you wait. Just a few seconds. Long enough for the moment to pass. For the damage to set in. It doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like strategy. Like self-preservation. Like survival. You tell yourself you'll explain later. Smooth things over. Maybe no one noticed. Maybe it wasn't that serious. You weren't trying to hurt them. You just froze. That's what you say. But something in you knows the truth. You protected your image, not your friend. And the worst part is how natural it felt. How automatic. You didn't weigh it. You didn't struggle with it. You just chose instantly. And maybe this isn't the first time. Maybe you've done it before. Subtly, quietly, redirected blame. Let someone else absorb the awkward silence. Downplayed your role in something that went wrong. Allowed someone else to be misunderstood while you stayed silent and clean. You wouldn't call it sabotage, but that's exactly what it is. You're not a villain. You're just scared. Scared of looking foolish, of being exposed, of showing that you don't know everything. Scared of becoming the target of the same silence you impose on others. So you avoid it. You protect yourself. And the cost is always someone else. The people closest to you. Those are the ones you put at risk. Not because you mean to, but because their trust makes them vulnerable. Because they assume you'll protect them. Because they believe you're on their side. And in most ways you are. You'd never betray them deliberately. You care deeply. You'd help them move, support them through grief, show up when it matters. But not in those small public moments of pressure. Not when the room is watching. Not when it would cost you. Because in those moments, your brain doesn't calculate friendship. It calculates social risk. Who looks competent? Who sounds smart? Who is seen as credible? Who stays in control? You don't want to be the one who falters, so you let them stumble, and you stay standing. This is the part no one wants to admit, that your fear of embarrassment is stronger than your loyalty. That your instinct to protect your reputation overrides your instinct to protect someone you love. And it's not because you're weak. It's because your brain is wired to avoid shame, to scan for threat, to preserve status. In a primitive sense, social embarrassment feels like danger, like exile, like death. So you avoid it, no matter the cost. And the cost is trust. Not all at once. Not dramatically, quietly, piece by piece. You erode the sense that someone else is truly safe with you, that they can lean on you, that you'd catch them when they fall. And maybe they never say anything. Maybe they smile and nod and pretend it's fine. But they notice. They always notice. They notice how you don't speak up, how you downplay your connection to their mistake, how you laugh along with the group instead of standing beside them. They may never confront you, but something shifts, something breaks, and over time that space between you widens. Because no matter what you say afterward, how you apologize, how you explain, it doesn't change what you did when it counted. You stayed silent. And the truth is, if the situation happened again, you'd probably do the same. Because unless you interrogate that reflex, Unless you stare directly at the fear behind it, it doesn't change. It controls you. It makes decisions for you. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. You don't sabotage people because you're cruel. You sabotage them because you're scared. Scared of the look on someone's face when they realize you were wrong. Scared of the moment when the room turns toward you. Scared of being seen as less than. So you protect your image at any cost. But the cost is always someone else's dignity. And maybe now you're wondering how many times you've done it. How many friendships have quietly fractured around these invisible betrayals? How many moments passed where you could have spoken and didn't? And how much of your reputation, your likability, your reliability, your competence was built on someone else's silence, someone else's failure, someone else's shame? And you wonder if you can ever rebuild that trust once it's broken. If you can ever stop protecting your image long enough to truly protect another person. Because now you see the real fear isn't that you might look stupid. It's that you already have. How many times have you believed something, not because you understood it, not because you questioned it, but because it just felt true? Not because it was logical, not because it was proven, but because it was familiar. The words sounded right, the idea felt safe, and so you accepted it. This happens more than you think. You read something once, and it lingers, a phrase, a belief, a statistic. Later, you see it again. You recognize it. It feels familiar. And without even noticing, you begin to believe it. Not because you investigated it, but because it showed up again. That's all it takes. Repetition. The human brain isn't wired to seek truth. It's wired to conserve energy, and familiar information requires less mental effort. Your mind sees something it's encountered before, and it relaxes. It assumes safety. It assumes correctness. But familiarity isn't truth, and truth isn't always familiar. Think about how often you repeat things you've heard, phrases about politics, psychology, history, human nature. People never change. Money can't buy happiness. Everything happens for a reason. You've said them, maybe believed them, but have you really questioned them? Or did you just get used to them? Even your own thoughts betray you. The more often a belief appears in your mind, the more legitimate it begins to feel. Your brain doesn't flag it as repeated, it flags it as real. And soon you confuse internal consistency with external truth. It's not just you, it's everyone. This is why lies, repeated often enough, become indistinguishable from truth. It's why conspiracy theories spread. It's why propaganda works. It's not the content that matters, it's the repetition, the exposure, the sense of recognition. And once something feels familiar, your guard drops. You no longer ask if it makes sense. You stop checking if it's based on evidence. You stop asking whose interest it serves. You just accept it. This is the danger of unearned certainty. You build your worldview on impressions, patterns, recycled ideas. You start trusting the tone of a sentence, the format of a headline, the cadence of a speaker's voice. Familiarity becomes a shortcut for trust, and that shortcut bypasses thought. If you've always believed you're bad at relationships, or weak or unlovable, those thoughts become familiar, and familiarity makes them feel true. Not because they're accurate, but because they've always been there. You internalize them. You stop questioning them. You live your life around them. Imagine now trying to escape this loop. Imagine deliberately confronting every belief that feels natural, every phrase that echoes easily in your head. What happens when you treat each one as a suspect, demanding evidence, context, explanation? You'd realize how many are hollow. You'd notice how easily they fall apart when pressed. How little substance they carry. How many were inherited, not discovered. But doing this is exhausting and frightening because it forces you to admit that much of what you believe about the world, about others, about yourself, was never really chosen. It just got repeated enough to feel like yours. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to question every certainty you held, every moral rule, every assumption. You wonder how many were implanted, how many were marketing, how many were fear. You feel destabilized, untethered, because truth doesn't repeat itself like lies do. Truth is quiet, inconvenient, often unlikable. It doesn't advertise, it doesn't flatter, it doesn't seek approval, and so it's drowned out. Familiar lies are louder, and they're easier to live with. So you make compromises, you let some of them stay. You tell yourself they're harmless, that it doesn't matter if a belief isn't true, if it brings you comfort, if it helps you get through the day, and maybe it does. But then you look around at the world, at what people believe, what they defend, what they're willing to do based on familiar lies. You see how easy it is to manipulate belief, how quickly repetition becomes ideology, how certainty becomes violence. And suddenly, your own harmless beliefs don't feel so harmless, because you're part of it too. You're not outside it, you're not the exception. Every time you repeat a belief without examining it, you're continuing the pattern. You're letting familiarity masquerade as truth. And that means something. It means you're vulnerable, not just to being wrong, but to never knowing it. Not because you're incapable of learning, but because you've already stopped looking, because what you believe feels familiar. And that feeling has replaced the need to understand. That's the trap, not ignorance, not stupidity, just comfort, quiet, habitual comfort. And now the question isn't, what do you believe? It's why do you believe it, and what happens when that answer no longer feels familiar? What if everything you believe about yourself is just a clever distortion? Not a lie, exactly, but a quiet rearrangement, a gentle blurring of memory and motive. Your brain does this automatically. It edits reality before you even see it. Not to deceive you maliciously, but to protect something fragile, your ego. Every time you fail, your mind rewrites the story slightly. You didn't freeze because you were afraid. You paused to think. You weren't excluded because people dislike you. They were just busy. You weren't wrong. You were misunderstood. And maybe that's true. Maybe sometimes the world is unfair. But how would you know? You're not seeing it as it is. You're seeing it through a filter designed to preserve your self-image. And the more that image needs protecting, the more distortion is required. Imagine you insult someone, then later insist you were just joking, or you hurt someone, and claim you were only trying to help. You don't even realize you're lying. Your memory has already shifted. Your intention has been reconstructed. You believe your version because the alternative is too painful. You think of yourself as kind, fair, rational, but you've forgotten all the times you weren't. Not because they didn't happen, but because your mind quietly filed them away, adjusted the narrative, cleaned the edges. You're not dishonest. You just remember things differently. When someone criticizes you, you dismiss them. You tell yourself they're biased, angry, or wrong. You question their motive, not your behavior. You defend yourself instinctively, because accepting the truth would mean confronting a part of yourself you don't want to see. And this isn't unique to you. Everyone does it. It's how the mind protects itself from collapse. Because the truth is rarely flattering. You've been selfish. You've been cruel. You've judged people unfairly. You've done things that, if you saw them clearly, would make you feel ashamed. But your brain steps in. It edits, reframes, forgets. It tells you a version of events that lets you sleep. A version where you were trying your best, where you meant well, where you had no choice. And you believe it. Because believing the alternative would mean tearing down the person you think you are. Even your opinions shift to protect your ego. When a prediction you made turns out wrong, you quietly adjust your belief, then retroactively convince yourself you never really believed it in the first place. When someone you admire does something awful, you reinterpret their actions, just so you don't have to admit you were wrong to trust them. And sometimes you go even further. You reject facts that threaten your identity. You avoid evidence that contradicts your worldview. Not because you don't care about truth, but because the truth feels like an attack. Your brain treats it like a wound. It activates defense mechanisms: denial, rationalization, projection, anything to preserve your internal equilibrium. You might tell yourself you're open-minded, that you're capable of admitting when you're wrong. But how often do you really do that? How often do you sit with your mistakes without explaining them away? How often do you let yourself feel the full weight of being wrong? It's easier to avoid, to distract yourself, to move on quickly, to pretend it wasn't that bad, to look for reasons it wasn't really your fault. And maybe you don't even notice you're doing it. That's the most disturbing part. Because if your brain is editing your reality and you don't know it's happening, how can you trust anything you think you know about yourself? You might believe you're objective, but your memory isn't a record. It's a reconstruction. Your thoughts aren't facts, they're interpretations. Your certainty isn't a sign of truth. It's a symptom of protection. And if you dig deeper, if you really try to strip away the edits, the justifications, the flattering distortions, what do you find underneath? Who are you when the narrative breaks down? What if there is no solid core, just layers of protective illusions? What if the person you think you are only exists because your brain decided the truth was too hard to bear? And if that's true, then every time you defend yourself, every time you insist you're right, every time you rewrite the past to feel better, it isn't strength, it's fear, not fear of others. Fear of yourself, and maybe you've never really looked, not closely, not without the filter, not without the edits. Because deep down, you suspect that if you saw yourself clearly, even once, you might never recover. Would you correct them? If every person you trust said 2 + 2 = 5, would you push back? Or would you pause, just for a moment, and wonder if you were wrong? That pause is all it takes, because it's not about the math. It never was. It's about what happens when certainty becomes social, when truth isn't something you discover, but something you inherit, quietly, unconsciously, from the people around you. You think you'd resist, that you'd stand firm, but most people don't. Most people hesitate, just long enough to let doubt in, just long enough to start second-guessing their own eyes, their own thoughts, their own sense of what's real. And the more voices you hear saying 5, the harder it gets to say 4. You wouldn't change your mind all at once. It would happen in pieces. You'd start by softening your stance, saying maybe it depends, maybe there's context you're missing, maybe you just don't understand the reasoning yet. You'd tell yourself you're being open-minded, that it's wise to listen, but what you're really doing is adjusting to survive. Because disagreement isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Socially, emotionally, sometimes even physically. Being the one person who says 4 when everyone else says 5 doesn't make you brave. It makes you vulnerable, isolated, a threat to the cohesion of the group. And humans don't handle that well. Your brain isn't designed to find truth. It's designed to keep you connected, to avoid rejection, to blend in just enough to feel safe. When conformity becomes survival, accuracy becomes optional. That's why people repeat things they don't believe. Why they nod along when they're uncertain. Why they mimic the emotions of others, even when it feels wrong. It's not lying, it's protection. Sometimes even self-preservation. And if the group says 5 over and over again, loudly, confidently, with certainty and emotion, you'll feel it. Even if you resist intellectually, your body will still tighten. You'll start to feel the strain of contradiction, the friction of holding a belief alone. You'll feel the weight of being outnumbered, and slowly, imperceptibly, you'll start to doubt yourself, not because the evidence has changed, but because being wrong together feels safer than being right alone. Then one day someone asks you the question again, what's 2 plus 2? And your answer doesn't come immediately. Not because you don't know, but because you're trying to remember which version of truth is allowed. You're not sure if the answer is supposed to be real or safe. That hesitation, that tiny gap, is what conformity preys on. Not your logic, but your uncertainty. It doesn't need to convince you, just confuse you. Make you doubt your instincts long enough to reach for the approved response. And if the stakes are high enough, you will. You'll say 5, not because you believe it, but because belief has become irrelevant. You'll say it to stay close, to avoid friction, to protect your place in something bigger than yourself. And then, one day you won't even notice you're doing it. You'll say 5, automatically. You'll correct others who say 4. You'll feel a strange discomfort when someone asks why. You'll start to feel that truth is less about facts and more about loyalty, agreement, unity, and that will feel good. It will feel right, until one day something else shifts. The group changes direction. The new answer is 6 now, and you say it too. Without thinking, without resisting, because by then you've stopped asking what's true. You only ask what's acceptable. And maybe you never really noticed when that shift happened. Maybe you still believe you're thinking for yourself. Maybe you think your conclusions are your own. But look carefully. Can you still feel the line between what you believe and what you say? Or has that line dissolved completely? Blurred by pressure, softened by fear, erased by the quiet terror of standing alone? Because the question was never about 2 plus 2. It was about whether you'd notice the moment you stopped thinking for yourself. The moment truth became something you borrowed, something you performed. And if you can't find that moment now, maybe it's already behind you. What if you're wrong, but everyone around you agrees? Not just a few people, everyone. Your friends, your family, your co-workers. They nod when you speak. They echo your opinions. They reinforce your beliefs. Slowly you begin to feel certain, not because the facts changed, not because the argument became clearer, but because no one is disagreeing with you. That's how it begins. Not with logic, not with reason, with agreement, familiarity, belonging. Being wrong is painful. It threatens your sense of competence. It makes you feel exposed, inadequate. But being excluded, that's something deeper. It feels like death, not physical death, but social death. The sense that you are no longer part of the group, that you're alone, on the outside, unprotected. So you learn to conform, sometimes in obvious ways, laughing when others laugh, nodding along even when you have doubts. But more often, it's subtle, quiet. You stop questioning. You stop thinking too hard. You let yourself believe what the group believes, not because it's true, but because it's safe. And over time, you forget you're doing it. You believe you're being reasonable, careful, thoughtful. But beneath that, you're being guided by something else. Not accuracy, not truth. Belonging, approval, avoiding rejection. You say what they say. You think what they think. And you don't even notice how much you've stopped thinking at all. Now imagine this. You're in a group discussion, and someone says something you disagree with. Deeply, your instinct is to speak up, but something holds you back. A flicker of discomfort. The fear of becoming the outsider. You hesitate, just for a second, and then you say nothing. Later, you tell yourself it wasn't worth the conflict, that staying silent was the mature choice. But deep down, you know the truth. You were afraid, not of being wrong, but of being different. That's what makes this so dangerous. You think you're protecting your beliefs, but really, you're protecting your acceptance. You think you're making decisions, but really you're being shaped, moment by moment, by invisible social pressure. And the more agreeable you are, the more the group rewards you. They smile, they include you, they affirm you, and it feels good, safe, right. So you do it again and again, until eventually, the idea of questioning anything feels almost unbearable. Not because it's wrong, but because it might get you excluded. Now ask yourself, how often do you change your mind in private, just to avoid tension in public? How many of your convictions are truly yours? How many are borrowed from the people you're afraid to disappoint? You might believe you're strong enough to stand alone, but strength isn't proven in theory. It's revealed in conflict, in discomfort, in isolation, and most people, no matter how rational they believe they are, will avoid that pain at all costs. So you go along, you pretend, you hide your doubts, and eventually you don't have to pretend anymore. The lie becomes your truth. The mask becomes your face. And now, even when you're alone, you believe what the group believes, because the alternative is too painful to imagine. But here's the problem. Sometimes the group is wrong. Sometimes everyone is wrong. And in those moments, silence becomes complicity. Agreement becomes surrender, and your fear of exclusion keeps you from seeing what's real. You might think you'd speak up if it really mattered. But how would you know? If your fear of being excluded is greater than your fear of being wrong, how can you ever trust your own judgment? How can you ever be sure that what you believe is true, rather than simply popular? Maybe you've already experienced this. A moment when you realized much later that you were wrong, that everyone around you was wrong. But at the time, you couldn't see it. You didn't want to. Because seeing it meant standing alone, and standing alone meant losing everything. And now, you wonder how many other things you've failed to see. How many truths you've ignored. How many lies you've accepted. Not because they made sense, but because they made you feel safe. That's the trap. Not just being wrong, but needing to be accepted. Needing to belong so badly that you'd rather believe a lie than face rejection. So badly that even now, hearing this, you might feel defensive, resistant. Not because I'm wrong, but because I'm pointing to something you've tried not to see. You fear being excluded more than being wrong. And that fear doesn't just shape what you say, it shapes who you are, who you become, what you're willing to see, what you're willing to admit. And that's why it's so hard to escape. Because even now, you're not asking whether what you believe is true. You're asking whether you'll still be accepted if it isn't. What if the moment you learn something is the moment you stop thinking? At first, it sounds wrong. Ridiculous, even. Isn't more information supposed to make you smarter? Isn't knowledge power? That's what you've always believed, what you were taught. The more you know, the better decisions you make. But then you notice something strange, something subtle. With each new fact, you feel a little more certain and a little less curious. Certainty is comfortable. It gives you the feeling that you're standing on solid ground. It tells you you're right, that you've figured it out. But thinking, real thinking, isn't about standing still. It's about walking into uncertainty. It's uncomfortable. It means asking questions with no obvious answers. It means not knowing. And when you already believe you know, Why would you keep questioning? You don't notice the shift at first. You read an article, watch a video, hear someone explain something confidently, and without realizing it, you stop wondering, you stop doubting. You assume the answer has been found, and that further thought is unnecessary. You replace thought with belief, and belief feels safer than doubt. Soon your mind starts filtering new information. You pay more attention to things that confirm what you've already accepted. You feel frustration, even anger, when something contradicts it. You start defending the knowledge you gathered, not because it's true, but because it's yours. And every time you do that, thinking becomes harder, riskier, less appealing. You tell yourself you're being rational, that your conclusions are based on facts, but you forget how easy it is to arrange facts to support whatever you want. You forget that the more facts you collect, the easier it becomes to stop questioning altogether, to feel like you've already arrived at the truth, to confuse accumulation with understanding. There's a kind of paralysis that comes with having too much information. You've felt it before. Faced with endless options, studies, sources, you don't know where to start. So you don't. You skim, you scroll, you grasp at conclusions someone else already made. You think you're learning, but really you're absorbing, accepting, following. And then there's the other trap, the illusion of depth. You gather enough knowledge about a subject, just enough to speak confidently. And that confidence convinces you there's no need to look deeper. But understanding isn't built on confidence, it's built on humility, on the willingness to say, I don't know enough yet. But when you believe you do, when you think you've already arrived, the search ends. This is the paradox. The smarter you feel, the less willing you are to think critically. The more information you have, the more selective your thinking becomes. You stop questioning your assumptions. You stop examining the framework behind your beliefs. You build a mental world that feels complete, and then you stop exploring it. And maybe that's the real danger. Not ignorance, but premature certainty. Not stupidity, but overconfidence. The mind that knows just enough to stop thinking it needs to know more. Now think about the systems around you. Social media, news algorithms, curated feeds. They don't just give you information, they shape what you see, how you see it, and how often it's repeated. They reward certainty, outrage, quick conclusions, not questions, not doubt, not reflection. And in that environment, real thinking begins to die. Not suddenly, quietly, slowly, without you noticing. You start repeating opinions that aren't yours, using language you didn't invent, arguing points you haven't truly considered. You feel informed, but you've become a vessel, filled, not challenged. The volume of information makes you feel wise, but you're just louder, not deeper. And here's the uncomfortable part. The people who think the least often speak the most, because thinking takes time. It creates silence. And silence feels empty in a world that's always moving, always shouting. So we fill the silence with what we've already decided. And every time we do, we push real thought further away. Ask yourself, when was the last time you truly changed your mind? Not because someone proved you wrong, but because you sat with a thought long enough to see its flaws. How often do you search for the question behind your beliefs, instead of more reasons to defend them? It's not that information is bad, it's that we use it to protect ourselves from doubt. We use it to build walls around our thinking, to avoid the hard work of uncertainty. But real thinking, deep, painful, slow thinking, only begins when you're willing to say, I don't know. When you're not chasing answers, but trying to see the shape of the problem more clearly. When you let go of the need to be right, and sit quietly inside the possibility that you're not. The more information you get, the more reasons you have to stop thinking. Because thinking threatens the comfort that information provides. And if you're not careful, one day you'll realize you've stopped thinking altogether, and you won't even remember when it happened. What if you could remove every discomfort from your life and call it rational? You already do this in ways that feel small. You avoid conversations that might hurt someone. You choose entertainment that flatters your views. You seek comfort, and when questioned, you explain it away. Say it's just logical, just practical. You protect your peace. You avoid unnecessary stress, but that's not really the full truth, because you're not just avoiding discomfort, you're editing your reality, quietly, invisibly, shaping your beliefs around what feels safe to believe. You tell yourself it's strategic, efficient, that there's no point wrestling with ideas that only lead to anxiety or conflict. But deep down, you know what you're doing. You're not just making life easier, you're making it smaller, cleaner, less honest. You say it's about balance, about boundaries. But when does a boundary become a blindfold? When does protecting yourself become deceiving yourself? You filter what you hear, what you read, what you let matter to you, and each time, the justification sounds smart. You call it discernment. You call it emotional intelligence. But what if it's cowardice, hiding behind good branding? And what if you're not alone in this? What if this is what everyone around you is doing too? A whole culture quietly agreeing not to look too closely, not to question too much. Each of us trading honesty for harmony, complexity for convenience. It's subtle. You don't feel it happening. You make one compromise, then another. You smooth out the rough edges of your conscience. You adjust your ethics just slightly, to fit the context, to match your circumstances. You tell yourself you're adapting, but really, you're shrinking. Eventually, the line between right and wrong stops being moral. It becomes emotional. You side with whatever brings you the least discomfort, and then backfill a reason to make it seem noble. And the most dangerous part is, it works. It feels good. It feels calm, logical, controlled. But comfort is not logic, and safety is not truth. What you call rationality may just be your defense against the unbearable, a polished way of saying, I don't want to feel that. You cloak your choices in words like efficiency, self-care, clarity, but beneath them is the same old fear. Fear of conflict, fear of uncertainty, fear of seeing something you can't unsee. It's easy to believe you're being logical when your decisions line up with what you already want. When the conclusion you reach just so happens to be the one that spares you the most discomfort. And slowly, over time, you stop noticing how much of your morality has been negotiated away. How often you've chosen the easy truth, the convenient ethic, the pleasing answer. You don't believe lies exactly. You just choose not to interrogate them. You let them live beside you, unchallenged. And then one day you look at someone who's made a choice you find reprehensible. You feel shocked, disgusted. You think, how could they believe that? How could they live like that? But if you traced their reasoning, it wouldn't be that different from yours. A few steps here, a few justifications there, all of it sounding rational, reasonable, logical. That's how it works. You start with values, but you end with preferences. You think you're making decisions based on ethics, but you're really negotiating comfort. And the more you get used to that, the harder it is to tell the difference. The easier it becomes to mistake what feels right for what is right. Until eventually, morality isn't something you live by. It's just something you reference. When it's convenient, when it doesn't cost you too much. So when you're faced with something truly difficult, something that demands sacrifice or confrontation or honesty, you won't know how to face it. You'll reach for logic, but it won't help you, because logic never made your choices. Fear did. And you called it wisdom. You called it boundaries. You called it logic. But it was just a long, slow retreat into comfort. And now you can't remember when you last made a hard choice without needing to feel good about it afterward. Why do you excuse yourself? When someone else makes a mistake, misses a deadline, says the wrong thing, hurts someone they love, you judge them based on what they did, what you can see, the result. You don't ask what they meant to do. You don't wonder what they were trying for. You look at the outcome and decide. But when you make the same mistake, something shifts. You remember your intent. You think about what you were hoping would happen. You explain to yourself that your heart was in the right place, that you didn't mean to cause harm. You want to be judged on your inside, not your outside. It feels fair when you do it. But when someone else tries the same thing, it feels like an excuse. And you don't notice how often you do this. When you forget to call someone back. When you snap at a friend because you're tired. When you lie, just a little, because the truth would be awkward. You replay the moment in your head, not to evaluate your actions, but to remind yourself of your reasons. To preserve the image of yourself as good. But if someone did that to you, would you accept it? What if they were tired too? What if they were overwhelmed, distracted, or just afraid? Would you believe them? Would you forgive them? As easily as you forgive yourself? You probably wouldn't. Because something inside you demands a clean story. Someone is right. Someone is wrong. Someone wins. Someone loses. Someone causes harm, and someone else suffers because of it. That's how we process the world. And when you're the one suffering, you need someone to blame. So when others hurt you, you rarely think about their fear or their confusion or the way they tried to do the right thing and failed. You just feel the result. You just see the cut. But when the knife is in your hand, everything looks different. You hesitate. You remember that you were scared. You meant well. You were trying to help. You didn't know what else to do. And so you excuse yourself. You create this split without realizing it. Other people's harm is evidence of who they are. Your harm is a mistake, a deviation from your true self, something to be explained away, not confronted. But what if that's not true? What if your actions are all that matter? What if intent is invisible and unknowable, and all anyone has to go on is what you did? Would that change the way you see yourself? You might say that's unfair, that no one can understand what it's like inside your head. But that's exactly the problem. You know your inner world better than anyone else. And that gives you too much power. You can always craft a story that protects you. You can always find a reason that makes you the victim, even when you're the one who caused the harm. And so the cycle continues. You hold others accountable for what they do. You hold yourself accountable only for what you meant to do. It feels just, but it isn't. It's not justice. It's insulation. It's protection from guilt, from shame, from the terrifying idea that maybe you are not always who you think you are. That maybe you're not as kind, as careful, or as good as you hope to be. You think you're giving yourself grace. But what you're really doing is refusing to look closely. You're demanding that others live with the consequences of what they've done, while you get to live with the comfort of what you were trying to do. And that creates distance. It creates loneliness. Because if no one sees your intentions and you refuse to acknowledge the impact of your actions, then no one is truly known. Not even you. You think you're being fair when you hold others to account. But fairness would mean turning that same lens inward. Seeing yourself clearly, without excuse, without interpretation, without the softening that intent provides. Just the act, just the harm, just the truth. That maybe what matters isn't what you meant to do. it's what you did. Would you ever notice the exact moment it happens? The moment your thinking stops being thinking and starts becoming defense. At first, it doesn't feel any different. You make a judgment, you form an opinion, and it feels like reason, like clarity, like you've arrived at the right answer. But somewhere in that process, maybe so subtly you don't even feel it, something changes. The questions end, the doubt disappears. The edges of the idea harden. You've picked a side, and without realizing it, your logic begins to break, not because you're stupid, not because you're dishonest, but because the mind you were using to analyze has now become the mind you'll use to justify. At that moment, everything that supports your position becomes more believable. Every counterargument feels more threatening. You start reaching just a little for evidence that confirms what you already believe. You ignore things that used to matter. You forgive contradictions. You become more certain, more confident, and less accurate. You think you're thinking clearly. But really, you've started protecting something. You've become loyal, not to truth, but to your conclusion. And it doesn't take much. One emotional moment, one political opinion, one moral stance. You pick a side, and suddenly the part of your mind that used to explore becomes a guardrail. It keeps you from wandering too far, from asking the wrong questions, from seeing things that might hurt. Even your memory changes. You start remembering facts differently, emphasizing some parts and blurring others. You retell stories to fit your view, not on purpose, not to deceive, but because the mind quietly reshapes its own history to protect its present. And if someone challenges you, it gets worse. Their disagreement doesn't feel neutral, it feels personal, like they're not just disagreeing with your logic, but with you. You feel yourself tighten, your jaw, your chest. You prepare to argue, not to learn, not to explore, but to win. It feels like conviction, but it's actually fear, fear of what it might mean if you're wrong. So you double down. You build a wall of arguments around your position. You become selective, then rigid, then blind. You mistake the strength of your defense for the strength of your idea. Then eventually, you can't tell the difference. You stop asking, "What am I missing?" You start asking, "How do I prove I'm right?" And in that moment, something fundamental breaks. Because logic doesn't work in just one direction. It's not something you use to build your side. It's something that should reshape your side entirely every time new evidence arrives. But once you've chosen a side, you stop letting that happen. You start treating logic like a weapon instead of a mirror. And the more you believe you're being rational, the more blind you become to your own distortions. That's what makes it so dangerous. Not that people stop thinking, but that they think they're still thinking when they're not. They use complex language, confident tone, and long chains of reasoning. But underneath it all is one quiet rule. Don't betray your side. Don't question too deeply. Don't admit uncertainty. Because once you do, your identity is at risk. So now the real question isn't whether your logic is good, but whether you've even allowed it to work at all. Whether your mind is still a tool for truth, or just a machine running a defense program you no longer notice. And the worst part is, it happens in silence. You don't feel yourself shifting. You don't hear the snap, but you live inside its consequences. You grow more convinced, more suspicious, more self-righteous, and somehow less connected to reality, less flexible, less curious. You tell yourself it's principle, that you're standing firm, that you're fighting the good fight. But sometimes what looks like integrity is just fear pretending to be strength. Because the moment you pick a side, your mind stops asking the most important question. What if I'm wrong? And once that question is gone, you're not thinking anymore. You're just defending. What if you couldn't trust your own thoughts? Not because you were confused, not because you lacked information, but because your fear had rewritten reality just slightly until a lie felt more familiar than the truth. This isn't about paranoia, not in the way you usually think of it. It's not the belief that someone is watching you or that you're in danger when you're not. It's quieter than that, more plausible, more convincing. It starts with a subtle tension, a conversation that feels off, a glance that seems too long, a sound you can't quite place. You notice it, and then you notice it again. And slowly, your brain begins to organize the noise. You start connecting the dots, and that's where it begins, because once fear enters the system, randomness becomes suspicious. Coincidence feels deliberate. Neutral becomes hostile. You're not just interpreting the world, you're filtering it, bending it, until your expectations start shaping what you see. You think someone is angry at you, and now their silence confirms it. You expect rejection, and now every pause feels like proof. You're afraid you're being judged, so you read judgment into every glance. These patterns aren't real, but they feel like they are, and that feeling is enough to make you believe them. You become certain, completely, quietly certain, that what you fear is true, and certainty is dangerous. Because once you're certain, you stop testing, you stop questioning, you stop looking for evidence that you might be wrong. Every new detail becomes another thread in the story you've already decided is true. And it all feels so rational, so obvious, that you don't even realize what you're doing. This isn't just something that happens to anxious people. It happens to everyone. The fear creates meaning where none exists. It fills in the blanks. It rewrites memories. It alters perception. And it does it invisibly. So by the time you're sure, the truth is already gone. Think about it. You hear someone laugh across the room. You think it's about you. Why? No reason, just a feeling. But now you're alert. You're watching for more signs. You notice them glance in your direction. You see someone whisper. Your heart rate spikes. You interpret everything through the lens of threat. And now, even if you're wrong, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like you're in danger. And that's enough, because fear doesn't need to be right. It only needs to feel right. It only needs to hijack your attention, shape your memory, and feed you just enough false certainty to make the pattern seem undeniable. And once you believe it, you act on it. You avoid people who aren't avoiding you. You apologize for things you didn't do. You lash out defensively before anyone has attacked. You retreat. You spiral. You isolate. And none of it is based on what's real. It's based on what you fear. And the more you act on it, the more real it becomes. You create exactly the world you were afraid of. And then you call it proof. And here's the hardest part. Even when you know this happens, it still works. Even when you tell yourself not to jump to conclusions. Even when you try to stay calm. If you're afraid, your brain will still reach for patterns. It will still search for order. And the easiest order to find is the one that matches your fear. So you see rejection where there is none. You sense danger where there is only uncertainty. You feel hated when you are merely unseen. You invent a story without meaning to, and live inside it completely. And if someone tells you you're wrong, that the pattern isn't real, it doesn't help. Because the fear is still there. The feeling is still there. And the feeling always comes first. The story only comes afterward. That's the part we forget, that we don't invent stories to explain the world. We invent stories to explain how we feel. And when we're afraid, the story has to justify that fear, whether it's true or not. And sometimes that story becomes a prison. Because once the pattern feels real, you can't let it go. You need it to be true. You need it to justify your reaction. You need it to make the fear feel earned. And so you keep it alive, subtly, quietly, even as it begins to hurt you. You stop asking what's real. You start asking what fits. You stop looking for evidence. You start looking for confirmation. And in that shift, reality disappears. So the question isn't whether you're paranoid. It isn't whether the pattern is real. The question is, are you afraid? And if you are, what are you afraid of? Because until you name that fear, the pattern will always seem real. It will always feel true. And you'll keep living inside it, even if it was never there to begin with. Would you rather punish someone than stop them? Not rhetorically. Really think about it. Imagine you had two options. One, a quiet, effective way to prevent future harm. The other, a public, painful consequence for someone who's already done wrong. Only one can be chosen. One actually prevents more suffering. The other just makes someone pay. Then you hesitate. Not because the choice is hard, but because the answer that works doesn't feel like justice. It feels like letting them off easy. You want them to hurt. You want it to feel fair. That's the trap. You already know what works. Prevention saves future victims, but punishment feels better, more satisfying, more immediate. You're not thinking about outcomes anymore. You're thinking about balance, about revenge, dressed up as morality. And the deeper part is, this isn't rare. You do this all the time. You think of yourself as someone who wants good things to happen, who wants harm to stop. But when it comes down to it, you're more interested in people getting what they deserve than in avoiding future harm. You'll say it isn't true, that it's about accountability, that consequences matter, that people should learn. But those are just words, comforting ideas layered over a harder truth. Because if you really wanted to reduce harm, you'd do what works, even if it felt unfair. You'd focus on rehabilitation, not retribution. You'd intervene early, quietly, effectively, but you don't. You want to see someone suffer, not just to stop them, but to watch them hurt, even if they change, even if they understand what they did, even if they're no longer a threat. Something in you still wants to see them pay, as if suffering has value in itself, as if their pain is part of the justice equation. It's not logic, it's emotion. It's instinct. You crave the moment when the balance is restored, when the wrong is answered with pain, when someone pays the price, even if that price doesn't help anyone, even if it changes nothing. And here's where it gets more uncomfortable. That instinct, your hunger for punishment, it's not just moral, it's personal. It makes you feel safe. It makes you feel powerful. It gives you the illusion that order has been restored, that harm can be undone, that the world makes sense again. But it doesn't. Punishment doesn't undo pain. It doesn't repair damage. It doesn't prevent anything. It just shifts suffering around. It moves pain from one person to another and calls that justice. And you accept it. You prefer it because real prevention is invisible, quiet, ongoing. It doesn't offer satisfaction. It doesn't let you feel righteous. It just stops harm before it happens. And no one thanks you for that. So instead, you wait until the damage is done. Then you punish. Not because it's effective, but because it feels good. Even if it means the cycle continues. Even if it means the harm never really ends. You tell yourself justice is about fairness. But maybe fairness is just your word for revenge. Maybe you don't want to stop the cycle. Maybe you just want to make sure the pain gets passed to someone else. And maybe when you think of justice, what you really mean is punishment that feels right, whether or not it actually helps. So you keep punishing. You keep choosing satisfaction over solution. Because deep down, you'd rather see someone suffer than make sure no one suffers again. And you live with that choice. Quietly, repeatedly, calling it justice. Every time. What if the version of the story you remember isn't the version that happened. You think back to the moment you lied, or maybe it was the moment you stood by while someone else did. You remember feeling trapped, overwhelmed, uncertain. And when you recall it now, years later, your memory feels soft around the edges, less painful, less clear, less guilty. You remember being confused. You remember not knowing what to say. You tell yourself you didn't have a choice, that anyone would have done the same, that you were scared, that it wasn't your fault. And maybe that's all true, or maybe it's not. But now you're not just remembering the event, you're remembering the version of yourself that you can live with. This is how it starts, not with a lie, but with a small adjustment, a gentle tilt of the truth. A memory softened just enough to protect you, not from others, but from yourself. You don't do it consciously. There's no strategy, no moment of decision. Your mind reshapes the memory the way your body heals a wound, automatically, silently, invisibly. It closes around the damage. It preserves the version of events where you were trying your best, where your motives were good, where the harm wasn't really harm. This is a kind of forgetting, but not the forgetting of facts. It's the forgetting of accountability. You remember crying afterward. You remember the sick feeling in your stomach. You remember wishing things had gone differently. But you've slowly rewritten the reasons why. Over time, you've turned panic into innocence, guilt into misunderstanding, shame into confusion. And now, when you tell the story, if you ever tell it, it sounds softer, cleaner. You were young. You didn't know better. You didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. You were just trying to survive. But there's a part of you that still knows. It surfaces in small ways. In the way your voice changes when you talk about it. In the way your stomach turns when someone brings it up. In the way you feel uneasy when others tell their own stories of guilt and you recognize the same details, but not the same honesty. Your memory isn't a record, it's a negotiation between what happened, what you can admit, and what you need to forget in order to keep liking yourself. You don't erase the truth all at once. You bury it piece by piece, under layers of justification. You misremember who started the argument. You misremember how much you knew. You misremember what options you had. You misremember the look on their face. And with each revision, you feel a little safer, a little more innocent, not because you are, but because your mind has made it feel that way. This is the quiet mechanism of self-preservation. You don't want to be a bad person. You don't want to believe that you caused harm. So your mind edits the story until the worst parts no longer feel real. You still remember them. You just don't trust them anymore. You doubt your own guilt. You question the clarity of what you saw, what you felt, what you did. You become your own defense attorney, your own unreliable witness. And eventually, you start to believe the revised version. Because memory isn't built for truth. It's built for survival. It's built to let you sleep, to let you function, to let you walk past a mirror without flinching. But sometimes something breaks through. A detail you forgot. A moment that slips past your edits. A face you haven't seen in years, looking at you with a kind of silence that says they remember it differently, and you know they're right. And in that moment your innocence cracks. Not because anyone exposed your lie, but because you remembered, just briefly, what it felt like before you changed the memory. The shame, the clarity, the unbearable honesty of what you actually did. And you realize that your innocence isn't something you had. It's something you manufactured, carefully, over years, by telling yourself a story you could live with. Because deep down you weren't innocent. You just couldn't face the version of yourself that wasn't. And so you forgot. Not to deceive others, but to protect the part of yourself that needed to believe you were good, even if it meant remembering wrong forever. How many times have you been absolutely sure of something? So sure it didn't even feel like a belief anymore. It felt like knowledge, obvious, undeniable. And yet, you were wrong. Think of a moment like that. A fact you swore by, a memory you trusted, a judgment you defended, only to realize later that you misunderstood, misremembered, or simply didn't know enough. It's easy to brush that off. Everyone makes mistakes, but this isn't about mistakes. It's about confidence. The more certain you feel, the more likely it is that you've already stopped questioning. And once you stop questioning, you stop seeing. It doesn't feel that way in the moment. Certainty feels like clarity. It feels like strength, but really, it's a closing, a narrowing, a subtle collapse of openness into something tighter, simpler, more comfortable, and more dangerous. You think of your opinions as conclusions, things you've arrived at after careful thought. But how many of them were simply inherited, absorbed from others, reinforced by repetition, shaped not by truth, but by familiarity? You think you're defending facts, but maybe you're just defending comfort. And the more certainty you feel, the less likely you are to ask, could I be wrong? Not because you're arrogant, not because you're careless, but because certainty quiets the discomfort of doubt. It gives you permission to stop thinking, to stop examining, to stop learning. Now imagine that certainty isn't just a personal feeling, it's contagious. It spreads through groups, through cultures, through generations, and suddenly a community believes together. They stop questioning together. They reinforce each other's certainty until dissent feels dangerous, until doubt feels like betrayal, and truth becomes whatever they all agree to protect. You tell yourself that you're open-minded, that if presented with new evidence, you'd change your view. But be honest, how often do you actually seek out evidence that contradicts what you believe? How often do you genuinely listen to someone who disagrees, not to argue, not to correct them, but to understand why they see it differently? Most people don't change their minds because they see a better argument. They change because something breaks. A belief fails them. A contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. And even then, it's painful, because letting go of certainty doesn't feel like gaining truth. It feels like losing part of yourself. That's the trap. The more certain you are, the harder it becomes to recognize that you might be wrong. And the harder it is to recognize, the more likely it is that you already are. Now imagine someone completely certain of something false, not just mistaken, but confident in a lie. How would they ever know? They wouldn't feel confused. They wouldn't feel unsure. They would feel right. Absolutely right. Just like you do. This isn't just theoretical. Every conspiracy, every harmful ideology, every delusion, someone believed it with full conviction. Certainty doesn't protect you from being wrong. It hides that you already are. And the scariest part, the wronger you are, the more certainty protects you from ever seeing it. It's not a signal of truth. It's a symptom of blindness. So what do you trust, then? If certainty isn't reliable, if doubt is always possible, how do you ever know anything at all? You don't. Not completely. Not perfectly. And maybe you never did. But maybe that's the beginning, not the end. Maybe the point isn't to be certain. Maybe it's to be awake, attentive, willing to change, willing to say, I don't know, willing to be wrong, even when you feel right. Because in the end, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who don't know. They're the ones who are sure, the ones who never pause, never ask, never doubt, and never listen. And maybe without realizing it, that's already become you. What if the reason you still feel important is because you haven't forgiven your enemies? Not because they deserve punishment, or because justice hasn't been served, but because your usefulness depends on their existence. The moment they're gone, the moment the conflict ends, so does your role, so does your meaning. This isn't something you say out loud. You don't walk into a room and declare that you need enemies, but pay attention to how you behave. The way you keep old arguments alive, the way you interpret neutral actions as subtle threats, the way you position yourself again and again as someone resisting, someone standing against something, always vigilant, always necessary, without a struggle. What are you defending? Without an antagonist, who are you fighting for? The identity you've built, protector, survivor, reformer, truth-teller, it doesn't exist in isolation. It's shaped by opposition, by friction, by the presence of a threat. You might think you're just cautious, or principled, or determined, but somewhere beneath that is fear. Not fear of defeat, but fear of irrelevance. Because when peace comes, when enemies disappear, there's nothing left to fight, and nothing left for you to do. And that's the uncomfortable part. Not that you have enemies, but that part of you wants to keep them, needs them. It shows up in small ways. You scroll through news feeds, looking for things to get angry about. You interpret policies, comments, actions, always in the worst possible light. You notice who still supports the people you hate. You file those names away. And when things start to get better, when the conflict seems to be resolving, you feel restless, suspicious. You tell yourself it's not over, that they're just hiding, regrouping. You find reasons to stay alert. You talk about the past, about what they did, about how it can't be forgotten. You remind others what could happen if you're not careful. You don't feel peace as relief. You feel it as loss, loss of clarity, loss of purpose, loss of status. This isn't about justice. This is about function, who you get to be when you're fighting someone. Because when you lose the enemy, you lose the clean, simple structure of right versus wrong. You lose the identity that's been built around struggle. And you're left with something messier, ambiguity, complexity, the discomfort of not being sure what you're supposed to do next. If you've spent years organizing your life around resistance, what happens when there's nothing left to resist? Maybe you'll find new enemies. Maybe you'll reinterpret old ones. Maybe you'll fracture your alliances and turn on those closest to you, subtly shifting your perception until they too become adversaries. Because then you get to stay in the role that makes you feel real. This isn't just politics or activism. It's personal. Think about your relationships. Think about the grudges you keep alive, the narratives you refuse to update, the people you've quietly decided will never change. The way you retell stories to others, casting yourself in the same role again and again. Maybe the real fear isn't being hurt again. You might not want to admit it, but usefulness becomes addictive, especially when it's tied to conflict. You get praise, attention, identity. You get to be the one who sees the truth, the one who stands firm, the one who holds the line. But when the threat dissolves, all of that disappears, and you're left with the quiet reality that peace is harder, that cooperation doesn't reward identity the same way, that being ordinary, supportive, and invisible doesn't give you the same emotional return. And so, in moments you don't talk about, you feel a flicker of something like disappointment when tensions rise again. You feel validated. You feel needed. You feel real. Maybe the most dangerous enemies are the ones you create, not out of hatred, but out of fear that without them you don't matter. And the hardest thing to admit is that you might not want peace at all. What if you're wrong, but still feel absolutely certain you're right? Not just once, not in a moment of confusion, but over and over again, through years of decisions, relationships, judgments. What if every time you were convinced, you were simply responding to a feeling, not a fact? You like to think you're rational, that you gather evidence, weigh options, and arrive at clear, thoughtful conclusions. But most of the time, that isn't what happens. Something feels true. And once it feels true, you start looking for reasons to believe it, not the other way around. You trust your gut, your instincts, your emotional responses. You trust the story your mind tells you in the moment. But feelings aren't truth. They aren't evidence. They're just signals, often useful, sometimes misleading, and always filtered through your personal history, your fears, your desires. Still, you let them lead. You feel uneasy about someone, so you assume they're untrustworthy. You feel confident about a choice, so you assume it must be the right one. You feel offended, disrespected, excluded, and so you become certain someone has wronged you. And when evidence comes up that contradicts those feelings, you dismiss it. You reinterpret it. You protect the feeling, not the truth. Because the truth is complicated, it's hard to hold. It rarely lines up neatly with your emotions. And the moment the truth threatens your sense of certainty, your brain starts to fight it off, quietly, unconsciously, almost automatically. This is how bias works. Not through loud irrationality, but through quiet distortion. You don't notice it happening. You just keep trusting the part of you that feels most familiar, the part that makes you feel safe, the part that tells you what you want to hear. You feel certain, and that certainty feels like truth. But it isn't. It's just comfort. Imagine someone you dislike, someone who's frustrated you, annoyed you, maybe even hurt you. Now imagine they say something thoughtful, something kind, something true. Do you accept it? Or do you look for a way to discredit them? Because disliking them feels easier than reconsidering your judgment. Or imagine you're in an argument, and halfway through you realize you might be wrong. Do you stop, admit it, change your stance? Or do you keep defending your position? Because the feeling of being right matters more than actually being right. These aren't rare moments. They happen all the time. But you don't see them. You don't notice. Because your brain hides the contradiction before you can feel it. It buries the discomfort under certainty. And you move on, convinced, unaware. Even your memories aren't safe. You remember events not as they happened, but as they felt. You replay conversations, decisions, mistakes, but not to understand them. You replay them to reinforce the version that feels best, or the version that hurts least, or the version that protects your self-image. And the more you do it, the stronger the feeling becomes. The more you trust the feeling, the harder it becomes to question. Eventually, it becomes your truth. And you forget it was ever just a feeling. This is why facts often don't change your mind. Not because you're stubborn or unintelligent, but because by the time the fact arrives, the feeling has already taken root. And feelings don't leave just because logic tells them to. They shape everything that comes after. You think you're choosing based on evidence, but you're not. You're choosing based on which story feels most satisfying, most flattering, most comfortable, even when it's wrong. And this is what makes it so dangerous. Because it feels like the opposite of danger. It feels safe, familiar, natural. You don't feel biased, you feel right. And maybe that's the scariest part, that you might be wrong, not in spite of your confidence, but because of it, that the stronger the feeling, the less you question it. That the more certain you are, the more blind you become. And the more you believe you're thinking clearly, the more you're just protecting the story you already want to believe. Not because you're dishonest, not because you're broken, but because you're human. Because your brain wasn't built for truth. It was built for survival, for comfort, for coherence, for feeling like everything makes sense, even when it doesn't. And once you realize this, the world starts to look different, less certain, less obvious, less easy to judge. You start to see that almost everyone around you is doing the same thing, trusting their feelings, shaping their memories, building their own truth, piece by piece, without realizing it. And then you see yourself doing it too. You feel yourself clinging to a belief, not because it's true, but because letting it go would hurt, would leave you lost, would force you to admit that you didn't know, that you were wrong. And so you hold on, not to the facts, but to the feeling that you've got it right, even when you haven't. What if the thing that's ruining your life is something you secretly enjoy, not just tolerate, not just accept, but quietly, repeatedly choose? It's easy to say you want to change, to say you're tired of your patterns, your problems, your pain. You look at your habits, your relationships, your thoughts, and you say, I wish this were different. You tell yourself you're stuck, trapped, broken. You say you want freedom, healing, growth, but every day, without saying it out loud, you keep making the same decisions. You keep stepping into the same traps. You keep pulling yourself back into the same misery you claim to want to escape. And maybe it's not weakness. Maybe it's not self-sabotage. Maybe it's something worse. Maybe you like it, not all of it. Not the consequences, not the shame, but some part of you finds comfort in the pattern, familiarity in the pain. Maybe you like the control it gives you, or the drama, or the validation. Maybe you like the excuse it provides, the way it lets you avoid harder questions, harder work, harder truths. It's not conscious, it doesn't feel like pleasure, but there's something in it that you reach for. Again and again, you don't fix it because you don't really want to. Because fixing it would mean losing whatever it gives you. The chaos might be miserable, but at least it keeps you from boredom. The failure might be humiliating, but at least it protects you from the pressure of success. The pain might be awful, but at least it makes you feel something, something real. And what would happen if it were gone? What would you do if the anxiety disappeared? If the addiction vanished? If the victimhood no longer applied? What would you be without your suffering? You've built your identity around it. You've shaped your choices, your routines, your worldview to accommodate it. And now it's part of you. Removing it would leave a hole, a silence, an unbearable sense of freedom. Because if it's not there to blame, then who's left? Just you. And that's the part you don't want to admit. You don't want to face what's underneath. You don't want to look at yourself without the distraction, the noise, the old excuses. You don't want to admit that you're the one keeping it alive. You say you want clarity, but you avoid the thoughts that might actually bring it. You say you want peace, but you feed the stories that keep you in conflict. You say you want intimacy, but you sabotage every relationship that comes too close. And when it all falls apart again, you pretend to be surprised. You pretend to be helpless, but it's not helplessness, it's avoidance. You avoid healing because healing would remove the thing you still secretly need. It would force you to change what you do when you're alone, what you say when you're angry, how you think when no one's watching. It would expose you to the weight of real choice, real responsibility, real vulnerability. And you don't want that. Not yet. So you keep pretending. Pretending to seek answers while making sure you never find them. Pretending to want change while ensuring it never arrives. Pretending to be lost when in fact you're exactly where you've chosen to stay. Because even if it's painful, even if it's toxic, even if it's slowly destroying you, at least it's yours. At least it's familiar. At least it lets you keep avoiding the truth. that you could walk away at any time, but you don't. Because you like the feeling of saying you want something better, while never having to face what that actually requires. You like the illusion of growth without the discomfort of change. You like being the person who struggles, because being someone who heals would mean becoming someone else entirely. And you're not ready to give that up. Not yet. Maybe not ever.